number 23 of the Special Committee on Canada-China Relations. Pursuant to order of reference of Wednesday, September 23, 2020, the committee is meeting on its study of Canada-China relations. Il s'agit d'une réunion hybride.
This is a hybrid meeting in line with the 25th of January 2021 motion.
Carolyn Bartholomew, Chairman of the United States China Economic and Security Review Commission. Thank you very much for accepting our invitation and being here tonight. Please proceed with your opening remarks. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the opportunity to speak today. Just for those of you who don't know, the U.S.-China Commission was established by Congress when Congress voted essentially to pave the way for China to join the WTO out of lingering concerns about what that would mean. We do a report, which I'm happy to send copies of 575 pages with recommendations to Congress. And we are bipartisan. It's important, I think, to acknowledge that we are bipartisan, sometimes one of the only bipartisan institutions that's functioning here in Washington, D.C. So our countries, of course, share not only a border, but also values, belief in democracy, human rights, and the rule of law, respect for freedom of speech, religion, association, and a free press. We stand with you in opposition to the unjust imprisonment of the two Michaels and urge their immediate release. Our shared values are increasingly in conflict with and under assault by the Chinese Communist Party. Last Wednesday, FBI Director Chris Wray, testifying before the Senate Intelligence Committee, said, "I don't think there is any country that presents a more severe threat to our innovation, our economic security, and our democratic ideas. And the tools in their toolbox to influence our businesses, our academic institutions, our governments at all levels are deep and wide and persistent." He noted that the agency is opening an investigation into various Chinese government actions here in the United States every 10 hours and currently has over 2,000 investigations that tie back to the Chinese government. A major tool for CCP influence is the United Front Work Department, which seeks to co-opt and neutralize sources of potential opposition to the policies and authority of the Chinese Communist Party. United Front efforts take place both within and outside of China. The United Front has played an increasing role in China's foreign policy since Xi Jinping's leadership began. In 2019 alone, China's national and regional United Front system spent more than $2.6 billion US, more than the budget of China's Ministry of Foreign Affairs. The mission of United Front work includes the goal of guiding overseas Chinese to ensure they support the CCP. There is also a strong focus on co-opting and influencing non-ethnic Chinese foreign elites. United Front activities are tricky to discuss in light of increasing xenophobia and violence against Asian Americans. We must be careful always to draw a distinction between the CCP and the Chinese people. One major target of the United Front is Chinese language media in non-Chinese countries, which they seek to co-opt or outright control, ensuring that the CCP controls the flow of information available to Chinese speakers. For example, the China News Service, an official Chinese government Chinese language news platform, which also covertly runs other overseas media agencies, is officially part of the Overseas Chinese Affairs Office, which is controlled by the United Front. To address concerns about CCP influence in media, the U.S.-China Commission has recommended, among other things, that the U.S. Congress strengthen the Foreign Agents Registration Act to require the registration of all staff of Chinese state-run media entities, given that Chinese intelligence gathering and information warfare efforts are known to involve staff of Chinese state-run media organizations. We've also recommended that Congress modify communications regulations to require greater transparency regarding Chinese government ownership of media outlets and the clear labeling of media content sponsored by the Chinese government. United Front affiliated organizations include Chinese Students and Scholars Associations, Confucius Institutes, and professional organizations which offer benefits and support for Chinese students on university and college campuses. This support includes social networking, assistance finding housing, and professional advancement. In return, students are expected to rebut any criticism of the CCP and to encourage support for the CCP's global rise. Other sources of leverage exist for pressuring students and uncooperative others, including Uyghurs, such as threatening family members back in China. The U.S. Department of Justice late last year charged multiple individuals for their alleged attempts to threaten, coerce, or harass certain residents of the United States to repatriate to China. 8 were charged with conspiring to act in the U.S. as illegal agents of the PRC, with 6 also facing charges for conspiring to commit interstate and international stalking. Attacks on freedom of speech on campuses are rising, such as attacks on students who support the Hong Kong pro-democracy movement and challenges inside classrooms to teachings that question the CCP's narrative. At the same time, there is pressure to self-censor, which of course is a less visible response to the United Front tactics. This trend is a direct threat to academic freedom. The United Front leverages transnational professional organizations such as the Chinese Association for Science and Technology and Return Scholars Associations to pull in Chinese students and scholars as a labor pool for national priorities in technology development. Some of these organizations appear to be independent, but are actually subordinate to the official United Front Works Department. These efforts incentivize the transfer of research to entities within China. The sheer scale at which these transfers occur makes the effort strategically significant and potentially harmful. The United Front strategy also seeks to gain support of foreign corporations and business interests by weaponizing China's economy, leveraging the promise of continued or expanded access to Chinese markets to persuade these corporations to pressure their governments to adopt policies friendly to the CCP's interests. This strategy also includes extensive use of traditional lobbying. Policy responses should include a focus on increased transparency, which would also create increased awareness of funding sources and affiliations with foreign principals. The US and Canada are not alone in facing increasing Chinese influence operations. Countries around the world are experiencing the push and pull of the CCP's desire for power, influence, and primacy. Australia, of course, has been a testing ground for much United Front work activity. Even Estonia. In February, Estonia's Foreign Intelligence Service issued an annual report, and in there highlighted Beijing's growing ability to conduct influence operations in the West through economic leverage, surveillance of Chinese nationals abroad, and the cultivating of local elites. We share the challenge of facing the CCP's influence operations and must all work together on effective responses. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Bartholomew. And we'll now start our first round of questions with Mr. Chong for 6 minutes. Mr. Chong, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Chairman Bartholomew, for taking the time to appear in front of us today. I read your report, not the entire 500-page report, but the executive report. So thank you very much for producing a shorter executive summary for people like me. What is your view of the Belt and Road Initiative, and more specifically, what is your view of the China-led Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank?
Okay, here's the point at which I'm going to say that some of the views that I'm expressing are my own and are not necessarily the positions of the Commission itself. The Chinese government, the CCP, is really using the Belt and Road Initiative both to create markets for its own products and to increase its influence. They talk about what they desire, of course, is a community of common human destiny. Last year, the Commission did one hearing on China in Africa, and you could see that the impact of Chinese investment in Africa in a lot of different ways. This year, we're going to be doing one next month on China in Latin America. So the tools that they use within BRI are, of course, economics, the lending that they do, which, by the way, Montenegro, which got, I think, $1 billion for a highway building from China, has just actually told the EU that they need help repaying it, which is one of the concerns about all of the lending that they're doing, which is debt trap diplomacy, of course. They're using vaccines now, vaccine diplomacy, to try to increase their influence. And the AIIB, I think, was a real effort to try to create a new institution, international institution that would be Chinese designed and basically Chinese controlled. Right? They're struggling within the multilateral institutions. They're working hard to influence what's happening in the multilateral institutions, but it was their way to basically start one from scratch. we should all acknowledge that there's huge infrastructure investment needs in countries around the world. And that, I think, is one of the challenges that all of our countries working together need to be able to address. But some of it's insidious. Am I done with my time?
Yeah, no, not at all. Chairman, you recently talked about a system that Beijing uses called the Integrated Joint Operations Platform, which has the ability to audit entire populations. So I have two quick questions on this. First, can you tell us what role Huawei plays in helping to develop this surveillance technology? And secondly, can you tell us what your view of Huawei is with respect to national security?
Yeah. Again, that's an interesting question and touches right to the heart of what I think is China's promotion of what we call techno-authoritarianism. If you look at smart cities, I understand the desire for local governments to increase their efficiency, but they're allowing the Chinese government access directly or indirectly into things like controlling traffic, controlling water supplies, things like that, which could all be used against it. Huawei, again, I think it was just yesterday that a report came out that the Dutch have found, right, that Huawei was in their telecommunications network in a way that allowed them to even eavesdrop on the prime minister and the prime minister's conference. So I have been quite suspicious of Huawei all along. I think that this concept that they are free and independent of the Chinese government is ridiculous. I mean, you look even at companies that are supposed to be free and independent of the Chinese government, like Alibaba, and you see what's happening there. So I have concerns. I think we all have concerns on the Commission about how Chinese telecommunications can be used both to access data, access information, collect intelligence, and again, shut things if they want to do that.
Thank you. I read in your report that you noted and highlighted the negative influence that China's had on the World Health Organization. Do you think the WHO is in need of reform to curtail China's negative influence on the organization?
That's an interesting question. I think that there is a concerns about balance, really. I thought you were going to ask that about the WTO, not the WHO. so I mean, I think that there has been, again, this is speaking personally, some naivete or political pressure on the people at the top of the World Health Organization as they were going through trying to do this analysis and investigation of where the pandemic, where it started, where the coronavirus started. And I think that, again, we're all going to have to look at how to make sure that the people who work for these institutions are protected from any political pressure, which might skew what it is that they're saying. I will also point that this is a much bigger topic, but paying attention to where the Chinese government has its representatives participating in multilateral institutions is a really important thing to do, and we don't always pay enough attention to that. We actually have on our website, we keep a list that we have on our website of the roles that Chinese government representatives are playing. So yes, I would say the WHO needs some reform, but some of it is actually protecting the staff to make sure they can do their jobs.
A quick question. You recently indicated publicly that in the upcoming year, you will be looking closely at U.S. investment in China to make sure that investors in the United States are not pursuing investments that are in direct opposition to U.S. national and economic security. Do you think the Canadian government should be doing the same?
I hesitate to tell your government what it is that they should be doing. I am very aware of the sensitivity of us being the neighbors to the south, and my time is gone. The answer is yes.
It isn't your time, Mr.
Thank you.
Bartholomew. It's Mr. Chong's time is done. But
thank you very much.
That, I'm sure.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chong, and we'll now go on to Mr. Prajakatis for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Ms. Bartholomew, for taking the time tonight. In listening to your presentation and reading your analysis of the whole issue of China-U.S. relations, but China's relations with global democracies more generally, I have to ask a very straightforward question here, and that is there any hope for any relationship between China and democracies like Canada, like the U.S., and other democracies that is not, I won't use the word peaceful here, but that is not strained? Or are we really seeing the emergence of a second Cold War?
I think the response to that, I'm trying to think of the phrasing that President Biden, I was going to say President Obama, that President Biden has said. I mean, there are areas where we are going to compete. There are areas that are going to be confrontational, and that we have to figure out areas where we could work together also. It's not always easy to define those. I think that the Chinese government is excellent at trying to pit one country against another, one industry against another, one issue against another. Some of us here are watching with a little bit of concern that the discussions, the talks that are going on climate change, to make sure that, you know, what's happening in Xinjiang is not put aside, criticism of that is not put aside in order to get a climate deal. So I think the reality is we've got to figure out ways to work together where we can, and to disagree where we can't, and try to make sure that it doesn't become openly confrontational, which is, of course, his concern about the South China Sea and Taiwan and all of those issues. I mean, the reality is they're here to stay, and so are we, and so are you. And so, you know, we have to figure this out.
Well, on that, since you mention it, you talk about possible areas of where democracies like Canada, for example, can look to still work with China on, since climate change is really a global issue and certainly the challenge of our time?
Again, I think it's an issue that we have to figure out ways to work together. You know, the Chinese are able to produce things like solar cells at a much lower cost than it's driven, of course, the solar cell industry out of countries like the United States. But, you know, there are some technologies that they can produce that we all need access to. There's been some interesting analysis here in the United States where some people are saying, you know, we keep saying we need to cooperate with them, but basically the Chinese government knows what it needs to do to address climate change, and we know what we need to do to address climate change. And so working together, of course, it would be far more effective and more efficient, but we can't put aside our own responsibilities in addressing it in the hopes that somehow we'll all be able to work together on it.
Understood. Thank you very much. Do you believe that the Five Eyes allies are aligned in understanding China to be a top security threat and designating as such?
Again, that's an interesting question. I think that the Five Eyes are an important institution. I think that, again, so, you know, here I am, a Democrat. I think that with the Biden, President Biden being elected, it gives an opportunity to strengthen all of our alliances, which unfortunately went fallow or sour over the past 4 years. I recognize that there are different interests that different countries have, including within the Five Eyes, about protecting their economic relationships with China. And again, I think we have to figure out how we can work together, acknowledging that. But, you know, the economic coercion that China is doing to Australia I think should be a wake-up call for everybody.
Understood.
You know, yeah.
Understood. I have 2 minutes or less than 2 minutes, I'm told by the chair. With the final question, how has the U.S. responded to what is taking place in Xinjiang in terms of trade? As you know, and as this committee has heard, products that would find their beginning in Xinjiang, things like cotton, tomatoes, for example, it's understood by top human rights experts and top experts on trade that forced labor is almost certainly involved in the processing of those products from beginning and possibly all the way to the finish. How is the U.S. responding to ensuring that products made with forced labor are not entering the U.S.?
Well, the U.S. has certainly put some sanctions out and is banning some products from coming in. There was just a recent story that there's been some shortage of ketchup here in the United States, and some people wonder whether it has to do with the packages or whether it has to do with restrictions on importing tomatoes from Xinjiang. I at least will say that I think we all have to take action on these things. What is happening in Xinjiang it's a genocide. It's a blot on the conscience of the world. And I think working together, we need to figure out ways, right? So that the products don't just move from one country to another. Yes. There are different export markets. So we need to work together on all of those things.
Canada has moved in that direction, thankfully. Of course, there's more we can look at, I think. Thank you.
There's always more. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Prajus-Karas. Et maintenant, on tourne à Monsieur Bergeron. Monsieur Bergeron.
And now, Mr. Bergeron, you have the floor for 6 minutes. Thank you, and thank you, Ms. Bartholomew, for being with us. Your comments are very useful and relevant for the study in this committee. You have mentioned the words of President Biden, where he said we need to collaborate on certain issues with China, and on others we need to confront China. We have been hearing various testimonials, and from what you've been saying as well, it does indeed seem that China is using all of possible opportunities to establish its position for the future, in particular on the trade front. We know very well that Chinese companies have the obligation to be in compliance with the security requirements of the Chinese state, and some of them, including Huawei, send information back to the Chinese authorities, information that has been collected in the countries where they are trading. So given that perspective, how can we actually have collaboration with the People's Republic of China and its enterprises, given that on every possible occasion that the People's Republic of China and its enterprises find to actually use this collaboration for political reasons in the long term, then how can we collaborate, and what sort of precautions do we need to take to avoid finding ourselves in a situation where we want to work with China, but in the end we're just giving them additional tools in the People's Republic of China to actually rise up against us?
Thank you. That's a good and complicated question, which I think if I had the answer, we would all be in much better shape. But I'll try. And by saying that, I think that the reality is such that we have to figure out ways to engage with China. The terms, of course, are the question is the terms of the engagement that are taking place. They are so embedded in the global economy now, I just don't see that we could cut off relations completely. Partly because, of course, there would be concern in other countries. I'm watching with concern what is happening with Germany and France right now in terms of they're putting all their eggs in the economics and trade basket. But I think there are a number of places that we can work on these issues. So, of course, it's the national security concerns about what Chinese companies are doing, but it's also the whole system of subsidies and protective tariffs that the Chinese government is doing. So I'm going to just say that in addition to reforming the WHO, we really need to reform the World Trade Organization too, because we have got to get to the heart of what is creating this unfair competition. I used to serve on the board of an American manufacturing company, which actually has a plant in London, Ontario. And I know that American workers and Canadian workers can be the best in the world, but they are working on an unfair field. And so we need to make sure that we address all of these subsidies. And again, I think there's growing awareness around the world of concerns about China's rise and the way that they're rising. I think that they are being, in some ways, their own worst enemies with this stomping around, insulting people, what people are calling the wolf warrior diplomacy. And so I think there's opportunity, but I think we live in a world where we're not going to be able to cut them off completely. And, it's 1.4 billion people. I just think that the reality is we're going to have to figure out a way to work together with them on places where we can, and continue to push on the places where we can't.
Vous avez tout à fait raison.
You're quite right. It's a real challenge. We can't cut off all of our economic relations with a giant of this size. But the real question is to see how can we work together without becoming the losers from a geostrategic point of view. Now, in your report and in your opening comments, you talked about the influence of the People's Republic of China in international organizations. We've seen this in the WTO and also in the WHO. And we've also seen it, and this was revealed in an article published in Politico in April 2020, namely that the Secretary General of the ITU was a former official of the Chinese telecommunications and was trying to exercise his influence to promote Huawei in the 5G market. So, should we be distrustful of the influence of all the officials coming out of China, just like the companies who are perhaps working for the benefit of the Chinese state in all of the decisions that are taken in international organizations?
I think we need to be aware. I think we need to be far more attentive than we have been. I just wanted to mention on the geostrategic issue that you raised, and that is some of us I've been working on U.S.-China issues since June 4th, 1989, the Tiananmen Square massacre. And a number of us raised concerns through the 1990s and the early 2000s that China was building its military strength on the back of basically of the U.S. economy, that they were benefiting so much from the strategy that they had. They were using the currency in order to build their military. And we're being shut down. Can I just say that, listen, it's an honor for me to talk to all of you. And if there's an opportunity to address the questions further outside of this context, I would be happy to do so.
Mr. Chair,
Jeff, you're on mute.
Yeah, you were on mute.
You know what? I think I had it unmuted and just muted it by mistake. Thank you so much for that, folks. I was just saying, Ms. Bartholomew, thank you for your understanding. We do have agreed rules about how much each party how much time they have. So this is what I'm following. And now I'll turn to Mr. Harris for 6 minutes.
Let me get my timer on, Chair, and my machine has just gone blank on me, and I have to let it see me to turn it on. Thank you, Ms. Bartholomew, for joining us. Most interesting testimony so far. In 2012, Canada entered into a foreign investment and promotion and protection agreement. We call it FIPA. And it's been criticized as being, in key respects, non-reciprocal in favor of China. Like, for example, a general right of market access by Chinese investors in Canada, but not the other way around in China, allowing wider scope for investment screening by China than Canada, omitting a long-standing Canadian reservation for performance requirements that favor Indigenous peoples, and diluting Canada's established position on transparency in investor-state arbitration. Now, your commission recently did a study in 2020, last year, on this whole very issue in the United States. And could you tell us, first of all, what do you think of this kind of one-sided agreement, part of it based on historical realities, I guess, between Canada-China trade prior to then? What's your view on that, and what's your recommendations have you made, and how successful have they been in getting policy changes?
Well, we've made a number of recommendations, and Congress takes some and doesn't take others. I think we're going to see a whole lot more moving. There's some really large packages of legislation on U.S.-China relations that are moving through, about to move through the U.S. Senate. We'll see if it stays bipartisan. I think the issues and questions you raise about the one-sidedness of market access is certainly something, I'm going to throw it to the EU again, is something that the EU and China, when I heard that they were making this bilateral investment agreement, I actually thought, why on earth do they think that the Chinese government will comply with this agreement any more than they have complied with other agreements? And so, there is a lot of concern about that. There's a lot of opposition to creating new trade agreements with a country that's not abiding by the agreements that it's already made. I'm not sure if some of what you were asking about was about our CFIUS process and the reforms to the CFIUS process about Chinese investment in the U.S. Was that one of the questions that you were asking?
Well, I guess that's part of it.
But before you do that, I'm just pausing the time because I've been asked by the clerk, Madam Ms. Bartholomew, to indicate that it says here your microphone is not selected as the microphone for the computer right now. And I'm wondering if you can either unplug and replug it or else select it in your settings. If you see where it says where the mute and the microphone is,
yes,
and the little upward arrow beside it, if you click on that arrow, you can ensure that you've selected the right microphone. No.
No, the microphone says that it is from this head. Hold on. Let me
try that one. Is that better?
Madam Clerk,
is that better? Okay.
Better?
Sorry.
I'm just going to get the indication.
Is it better?
Thumbs up.
Okay, great.
All right, Mr. Harris, back to you, sir.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Well, I'm not familiar with that particular aspect of it, so I'll move to another question if you don't mind. One of the things our committee has talked about quite a bit over the past year, because we've been operating since then, was concerns about China not, wanting China to follow the rules-based international order, and how do we get to do that? Not, in a lot of things, not, arbitrary detention of individuals, of course, prisoners, but like Mr. Spave or Mr. Kovic being part of it, but in general terms, following the rules, whether they be trade and the investment and the other things we're just talking about. I'd like your advice on this, because what I hear you say is that they're trying to create new norms, whether it be human rights being watered down, different ways of engaging with other nations and that sort of thing. So is this something that we can actually influence in some way with the help and coordination of other nations, or are we in a gridlock on that as well?
I think we have to try. I mean, I think that to give up would be just to cede the field completely to the Chinese government and the authoritarianism, their ideology that they are trying to spread. I'd note a couple of places of concern. One, of course, is the national security law that they passed, that has destroyed Hong Kong as one country, two systems, includes in there a provision that they believe that they can basically reach into any country, anytime, if any of us have violated what they think is their law. And I just saw yesterday that there is a new push that they are intending to do to promote Chinese rule of law around the world and to make all of us comply with Chinese laws. So I think, we need to engage in the judiciary and the legal system to make sure that people are clear and engaged in it. And I think, again, that we need to figure out what countries are going to be most concerned about that and figure out ways and to have our own united front. Frankly, I'll use that phrase, but ways to have our own united front. It is, I believe, a clash of ideologies that is happening. And I just don't think that we can give up. I'm not always sure how to handle it, but if we give up, we have lost completely.
Okay. Thank you. Another issue that your group has written about is the Chinese attempts to influence United States academic institutions, think tanks, and through financial endowments and whatnot. And we have similar concerns in Canada. First of all, how effective has their efforts been to influence these institutions through financial endowments and other methods? And how dependent have some of these places become on receipt of support from Chinese interests to be able to operate?
They have become, I think, way too dependent on, when we talk about how do we make sure that the Chinese students who are coming to U.S. institutions are Chinese students who are coming here to learn, and not necessarily Chinese students who are coming here to learn and take back, especially on high technology things, the things that they are learning here. I think that some of it is we all have an obligation to make sure that we fund these institutions of higher education sufficiently, because I think that that's one of the things that's happening. They can't, if they lose the tuition from Chinese students, a lot of these schools are going to be in real trouble. That said, I think there needs to be transparency about what scientists, for example, researchers are taking money from what Chinese company or Chinese government. And I have always said that they should not be mixing that with U.S. taxpayer dollars. U.S. taxpayers need to know. Okay, I'm getting the time. All right.
Look, Ms. Bartholomew, I'll cut you. I'll speak. I mean, if you want to finish a sentence, usually that's okay, just so you understand what's going on.
Yes,
here, right?
I mean, it's a serious concern, and I think that transparency is one of the answers. And again, making sure that our institutions have the resources that they need.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Harris. We'll now go to the second round. Mr. Jennis, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Bartholomew. It's a pleasure to have you here. Your government across 2 administrations has recognized the Uyghur genocide. Our parliament has also recognized the Uyghur genocide, although our government has yet to. And there's been, I know, much debate in the U.S. about strengthening supply chain measures. In Canada, our system around preventing supply chain slavery, the use of forced labor in our supply chains, is essentially complaints-based. So our Border Services Agency adjudicates complaints when they receive them, but the mechanisms by which any investigation would be undertaken are still being worked out. It would be virtually impossible to conduct a meaningful investigation inside of China, and the new measures haven't led to any shipments being stopped. By contrast, in the United States, you have the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, proposed by Representative McGovern, that got a vote of 406 to 3 of support in the lower house and is now in the Senate. This bill would, as I'm sure you know, create a presumption that forced labor is involved in products coming out of Xinjiang, unless it can be proved otherwise. What is your view on the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act? Could you maybe share a little bit about why it has such strong bipartisan support, and reflect on maybe whether other countries should consider a similar model, recognizing the realities of just the impossibility of a complaints-based system actually working effectively?
Yeah. I think that it's an important and serious attempt to try to get to the very issue that you were mentioning. There is so much stuff coming over, being we did a hearing a number of years ago on seafood, Chinese seafood, and learning the realities of how much product comes in through our ports, how few people we have tracking it. All of those issues, I think, are part of the solution too. I absolutely support the Forced Labor Prevention Act. I think the fact that it had such a huge margin in the vote demonstrates the serious concern that people have about what is going on with the Uyghurs. And so I think that it would be useful for all of us to figure out a way to do it. That said, I have to be realistic that implementation of something, again, with the seafood, we learned that when things were turned away from one port, the cargo simply went to another port. So we need to make sure all of that. And of course, there's nothing stopping companies from changing their labeling. So I think some of it also has to be recognizing what the products are that are being produced and really focusing on those products.
Thank you. And I think that the points you make just underline how easy it would be to circumvent any kind of complaints-based system, and why, whether it's the framework that Representative McGovern has put forward or something else, that we need to do so much better here. Jumping to another topic, there are those who say that the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank is completely different from the Belt and Road Initiative. There are others who see the AIIB as part of the strategic agenda, which is the Belt and Road Initiative. What is your view on that?
I think that the Chinese government will use all of the tools that it has at its disposal to accomplish what it is that it wants to accomplish. In terms of the AIIB, I think it's incumbent on the other parties who are participating in the AIIB to make sure that contracts that are going out are not being taken all by Chinese contractors, to ensure that the projects uphold human rights and environmental standards. So the onus in some ways is on the participants in the AIIB to make sure that it is not just being used to carry out China's plans. The Belt and Road Initiative, there's also some very interesting analysis that some people think it just isn't going to become everything that China says it's going to become, because they don't have the money to do it, and they have pushback, in their own population.
Just a quick follow-up question. You spoke about us having our own united front. It's interesting to me that on the one hand, China is creating its own institutions of influence, and on the other hand, our countries, especially Canada, are putting our dollars into, in some cases, Chinese government-led vehicles like the AIIB, and in other cases through UN-led development vehicles, which China is exerting more and more influence over. When you talk about creating our own united front, is that sort of a call to have a stronger infrastructure of democratic nations that are actually doing more things on our own that reflect our values?
You're talking about what the summit of democracies. I think that we have got to, again, figure out ways to work together with countries even that are not necessarily good on human rights. I think of Vietnam, for example, with countries.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Sorry. Thank you very much, Mr. Jennis. And we'll maintenant continue avec Monsieur.
And now Mr. Lightbound for 5 minutes, please. Good evening, and thank you very much for being with us this evening. Really enlightening and very much appreciated by all of us. In your remarks, you talked about 1 billion as a loan to Montenegro, and you talked about the economic coercion that China is exerting in Australia. What is the most frequent modus operandi used by China when it's exerting its economic and monetary influence on Western democracies and across the planet, in fact? And what are the main practicals and principles that our democracies should maintain to guide us and arm ourselves against this type of economic coercion? And also, to come back to what Mr. Jennis has just asked, do you think that a concerted international effort should be our priority? Should we work better together as Western democracies to fight against this influence? So basically, that's my question or questions for you, Madam.
Okay, thank you. I'll start with the last one first. I mean, I think we absolutely need to work together as concerted efforts, and be attuned to the fact that the Chinese government is really good at, as I said earlier, divide and conquer. I just want to say I'm not sure that Montenegro was actually $1 billion, so I'm going to have to check the fact on that one. So I don't want to get that number wrong. You know, the tools of coercion that they're using in some ways are really the business interests in all of our countries. It was before the pandemic, I participated in a conference in Australia, where the defense and intelligence establishments were really trying to work at how to raise concerns and deal with the economic interests that they have. It's economic interests in the United States, in Canada, and all of that. And I think the important thing for politicians is to recognize that they represent some of those interests, but they also have a national obligation to national security. It's a difficult message to do, but you know, again, from when I think of Chinese economic coercion, the first example that I think of, it might not be the first, was when they cut off their imports of Norwegian salmon. Because of the Nobel Prize going to Liu Xiaobo. And that was, it's in some ways, it's like a test case, right? That's what I think they do a lot. Now they're doing this with Australia. It's a test case with Taiwan and pineapples. It's a test case to see how the world will respond to this. We respond by increasing our consumption of Taiwanese pineapple, of Australian wine, and all of that. But I think some of it is really educating the business community that continues to believe that things are going to go well for them inside of China, and they aren't necessarily going to do so. That's some. If it's resources, that's a different story. I think it's just going to have to be, you're just going to have to make the case that their national security interests and selling these products have a cost, right? They have a cost beyond any financial cost that's taking place.
Now, your commission also mentioned that there needed to be more detailed examination of U.S. investments in Chinese firms to avoid financing the militarization of China. Could you give some details? What could be the impact on Western investments into China?
Yeah, I think there some of it is it's educating again, right? I mean, when I think of this issue of U.S. investments in China, some of it is the major investments banks. They're going to figure out a way to make money no matter what. But when you look at things, we haven't mentioned the military-civil fusion that China is doing, where they are using civilian companies and technologies to acquire the technology, develop the technology that they need for their military purposes. And so it's sticky. It's very difficult for some people, for some companies, to be able to figure out exactly who it is they're investing in. That said, I think some of them don't care. I mean, Ray Dalio had this piece in the Financial Times relatively recently, and I was just frankly appalled at what he said, which was basically, money is money, and we don't know who's going to win this competition, and so I'm investing in China as much as I can. And I just think that's appalling. So I think we have to come up with ways to hold companies accountable when they are investing in something that is actually going to be a threat to us. Not economically in that sense, but militarily. And we're also very concerned about pension funds, right? The pension funds that are being invested, people who have those pensions don't know where their money is being invested, and they don't know how risky some of those investments are. So it's twofold. It's risk, it's also so I risk as in financial risk, and it's also risk as in what are we investing in, and what are we getting out of it, and what kind of a threat is it for us? There are always going to be people again who
Thank you. Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Lightbound.
Thank you very much to Mr. Lightbound. And now we're going to turn to Mr. Bergeron for 2.5 minutes. So we'll try and go quickly. Now, you've talked about just a moment. The Confucius Institutes. And they've got such a well-developed system there to try and influence the lives, the political and social lives in the countries in which they've established themselves. So what would be the difference for you between the Confucius Institutes and the equivalent with the French Institute or the Goethe Institute for Germany? Are there comparative elements? Or are we talking about a completely different universe with the Confucius Institutes?
Again, another excellent question. I think that the Confucius Institutes play a role that the Goethe Institute or the Alliance Française do not. I think that they are serving as a tool on campuses, both to control the Chinese students who are there, as well as to spread Chinese Chinese worldview. And I guess maybe some of it is I'm just also concerned that I don't agree with the ideology of what the Chinese are doing. But they also serve as platforms for espionage. They're just all things that they are being used for, Confucius Institutes. I do want to mention one thing which hasn't come up, and that is education programs that are starting even as young as grammar school that are being funded by Chinese entities, and children who are learning Chinese, which I think is a really important thing for them to be learning, are also learning Chinese ideology that goes right along with it. So it's not just the Confucius Institutes, but it goes further down, and again requires a government response in terms of funding to make sure that kids are getting what they need. But again, to me, the Confucius Institutes are just fundamentally different than what Western democracies are doing with their centers.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. I imagine I don't have much time left, Chairman, so I don't want to try to put a question that our witness wouldn't have time to answer. Thank you very much, Mr. Bergeron.
Harris for 2.5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair. And Ms. Bartholomew, your interchange with Mr. Genuous interested me in that you seem to have a slightly different view than Mr. Genuous, who seems to think that we, i.e. the democracies, must get together and stave off the China and its friends. And you suggest a little bit more nuanced response to that in terms of, not disengaging totally with China, obviously, but also making sure that we're engaged with other players to convince them or to work with them to develop better norms. Could you elaborate on that a little bit, please?
Yeah, I don't want to leave the impression that I don't agree that democracies need to get together. I think that they do, because I think, again, our own united front, our values stand for something, and they stand for something around the world. And I think that we diminish the importance of those values. That said, I think we're going to have to recognize that there are times that we are going to be needing to work with countries that might not align with us completely on things like human rights. So would I invite the government of Vietnam to join an alliance of democracies? No. But would I believe that there are ways that we need to work with the government of Vietnam to address concerns about what's happening in the region? My answer would be yes. So I think in that sense, the fluidity is, we just have got to acknowledge that there's not going to be a 100% purity test with the countries that we need to engage with around the world. That said, there is a core group of Western liberal democracies that I think really need to work together on all of these issues.
So you're not suggesting some sort of cultural Cold War?
No, I'm not suggesting a cultural Cold War. I think what I'm trying to do is to be realistic about the fact that even within Western liberal democracies, there are going to be some differing interests in the relationship with China, and we have to figure out a way to accommodate those. Accommodate isn't the right word. We have to figure out a way to recognize that those interests are going to be there and not let those interests get in the way of the places that we can all work together.
Thank you. I think that's probably close to time, Chair.
You have about 15 seconds.
I think that I'll pass that on to the next intervener.
That's very kind. Thank you very much, Mr. Harris. And I'll go to Mr. Williamson for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Chairman and Chairwoman. It's nice you could join us tonight. This has been very, very interesting. Could I ask you had an interesting exchange with MP Lightbound a few minutes ago about the review of investments into mainland China and the impact on your security as well as risk. What about the other way around? Any kind of investigation on investments into the U.S. stock exchange, the bond market, equity markets? I read an interesting paper recently which looked at how during the Cold War, one of the challenges that the Soviet Union had was very little access to Western capital, whereas in today's world, China has great access to American capital in particular, but Western in general, and it has helped them. It's helping them immensely, and we don't even know how these investments are being made and how they're helping China often use our own technologies against us, or if not us, against minorities in mainland China.
Yeah. Well, you know, of course, when you take on the moneyed interests, you're taking on big giants who don't want anybody to get in the way of what it is that they are doing, right? The sort of Ray Dalio view of the world. The Commission has, I'm just trying to think the number of years that we have been talking about and raising concerns about Chinese companies on U.S. stock exchanges. Things like the accounting standards. You know, we can't get access to the work product papers of audits in Chinese companies, the risks that take place. There's all sorts of mechanisms that are happening for the flow of money. I think the CFIUS reform that we did, it's called FIRMA, I can't even tell you what all the words are now, but the CFIUS reform was an effort to try to address some of these concerns about the acquisition of Chinese companies by Chinese companies of American assets, including even their, I would say, real estate, right? I mean, if they're buying land for a quote unquote warehouse near a sensitive military installation, somebody needs to be making sure that we're paying attention to that. So the concerns about the stock market have been there. I think Congress is really aware of that and paying a whole lot more attention to it. The concerns about what Chinese companies through a number of mechanisms are buying in the United States. And I'm even going to put money laundering on the table. There was a story that just came out about a delicatessen owned by a coach in New Jersey that had that made $100 million, and there was a very complicated shell corporation system that tied into Macau. And right. So, you know, there's money laundering aspect of all of this too.
So more work than to be done on that.
Yes.
In both countries, and I think you had more to say about WTO reform. Could you, when you were talking with my colleague MP Chong right off the top, you thought a WHO question. Why is that an issue? Is it your belief that China's, and we have about 2 minutes, and I'll give most of it to you, that China has not fulfilled its obligations from 20 years ago, effectively getting away with it, and now we're potentially countries are rewarding them with more trade deals where they won't live up to it? Why is that important? Why did that strike you as something to talk about?
Well, again, when China got accession to the WTO, some of us had a number of concerns about whether the WTO was going to change China's practices or China was going to change the WTO. And the WTO is just, I think, I do not advocate that we get rid of it, but I think that there need to be some reforms to deal with things like subsidies, government subsidies, state-owned enterprises. It's just not sufficiently prepared or mandated to deal with the kinds of economic steps that the Chinese government is consistently doing. So, yeah.
Could I ask you? I think we would give about a minute. Is there a growing consent, or is there a growing volume of lawmakers on Capitol Hill to remove China from WTO or to disband WTO? I'm just curious to get a sense of what you're hearing on that.
Yeah, I there are always some people. Interestingly, this commission was considered outliers and quite hawkish when we were started, and we're not considered that anymore because the whole issue has changed.
Look,
we haven't.
But I just want to say
seconds.
that we. Oh, go ahead. Yep, you go first. Yep. Well, at the same time, you said Alibaba. What's happening to it? A kind of a company that's a little bit free. You mentioned in one of your comments, we all know what's happening to Alibaba. Could you just, for the sake of this testimony, explain what's happening to Alibaba?
Yeah, well, the Chinese government has first, of course, pulled back an IPO, and they now just most recently look like they are trying to push Jack Ma out completely from what he's doing. And the reason this is important is it's always been held up. Alibaba and Ant have been held up as private companies, right? I mean, they are private companies functioning independently, and they aren't.
Thank you, Mr. Williamson. Et maintenant, on continue avec Monsieur Dubourg pendant 5 minutes. Monsieur Dubourg.
Now, Mr. Dubourg, please, for 5 minutes. Thank you, Chair. And thank you to Ms. Bartholomew for being with us this evening. And you'll see that things go quickly here. You have to jump from one subject to another really quickly. It just shoots past. But it's very interesting to hear your comments. I'd like to talk about another aspect. In your profile, I saw that you were a member of one of the first delegations to go to Africa, dealing with AIDS and children suffering from AIDS. Now we find ourselves in the midst of this COVID pandemic, and we know that we've put in $230 million to help developing countries, and then the US is over $2.5 billion that you have provided. But in your introduction and in your comments, I think you also said that China is starting to try and get a footing in these countries through vaccine diplomacy. So do you think that the investments that we're making to help developing countries to counter COVID, do you think that's going to be sufficient given this overall context?
Given the vast need, I think that the amount that Canada has contributed and that the U.S. contributed is just a starting point, right? I mean, I think I read the other day that I'm not sure that any vaccines have even made it to Haiti. So we have an obligation both to the world, right, for moral reasons, but we have practical obligation to the world in all of this, which is we are not going to be safe to fly around the world and go to places we like to go when other people in other countries are not safe to do that. So I would say that. I also think, there are questions about the efficiency and the efficacy of the Chinese vaccines, which I think, Chile, I think, has vaccinated a fairly large portion comparatively of its population, but the rates of its infection continue to go up. And I don't know, I'm not an epidemiologist. I can't say if that was, just from variants that are happening, but when China contributed PPE at the beginning, in the early months, it turns out that first they didn't donate a lot of it, some of it that we're expected to pay for, and some of it was inadequate and insufficient. So I think, again, here is an opportunity for us to go out there and represent our values and work with these other countries to make sure they have the vaccines that they need.
Merci.
Thank you very much for your interest in this. And on Haiti, that's my country of origin. So it seems that for the moment, they have not been too adversely affected. There haven't been many tests either, but I think that they've got other pressing political issues to deal with there in Haiti. Now, very quickly with the time that's left, once again, in your introductory comments, you said that you feel concerned, like all of us, about the fact that the two Michaels remain imprisoned. We've taken lots of different action, and you've said, given the population over there, we have to find means to be able to work together. There's several measures that have been set up, but so far that hasn't actually borne fruit with the two Michaels. So do we need to put more pressure on China? Or should we continue to try and collaborate with China so that we can have a happy ending for those who have been arbitrarily detained?
Oh, that's a difficult dynamic. I think that your diplomats are having to deal with. I'm aware of what the reports about the Halifax Security Forum and what was happening there with the award for Taiwan. I don't think that we can put aside our concerns about rule of law and fundamental human rights. I think that we have got, again, to figure out a way to expand those rather than to contract them. And I think the recognition of China's willingness to arbitrarily detain people is something that anybody who thinks about traveling to China needs to be aware of. I personally don't know that I can ever travel to China safely again. And Hong Kong. I mean, I don't think that I can go to Hong Kong unless there is some change at the top. And American business people need to be worried about this. Canadian business people need to be worried about this. So yes, we need to be focusing on it.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much. Merci.
Thank you very much, Mr. Dubourg,
for being with us. I know all members enjoyed your testimony and your answers. So thank you.
Whoops, we lost you again, Mr. Reagan.
Oh.
No, I just did. Hear me now? Briefly there. Yes.
Oh, okay, good. So I just wanted to thank you for your testimony. It's much appreciated. Very kind of you to join us. We'll let you go as we have other witnesses to go on with, but it's been great having you with us. You're welcome to stay, but we're going to go on to the next.
No, that's okay. Could I just one more thing, and first express my appreciation to all of you for being interested in what we're doing. And I presume that you know that there are interparliamentary working groups in China, in Europe, for example. That again, we are not the only places that are trying to figure out how to deal with these. So I recommend them to you if you are not engaged with them.
Thank you so much.
Thanks very much. I am going to drop off. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. We'll now suspend for 2 minutes to do the sound checks for the next pair of, I think it's pair of witnesses, I believe. So we'll suspend for 2 minutes. For our second panel, I'd now like to welcome as an individual, Monsieur Michel Junot-Katsuya, expert in national security and intelligence. Merci d'être ici ce soir.
Un honneur et un plaisir.
I'd also like to welcome Professor Anne-Marie Brady from the University of Canterbury in New Zealand. Ms. Brady, thank you for making the time for us during your holidays, and congratulations for your 25-year wedding anniversary. Monsieur Junot-Katsuya, nous débuterons par vous pour les remarques d'ouverture. Vous avez 5 minutes. La parole est à vous.
So you have 5 minutes for the opening comments. Thank you very much, Chair. I'm just going to put on my timer to make sure that I respect the time. So there we go. Thank you to all the members of the committee.
To present in both official languages, which is very much the Canadian way, I suspect. My apologies to also the teams of translators. Unfortunately, I had difficulties with my technology today, and I was unable to deliver my text ahead of time. Tonight, I would like to present my introduction to speak about national security issues. My concern comes from 3 decades of observation as a member of the Canadian Security Intelligence Service, being able to monitor, study, and teach even the activities of the Chinese intelligence services in Canada. Il y a de grands niveaux.
There are high levels of concern that exist when we look at the imbalance that exists in the relationships between Canada and China. We're not on a level playing field, nor do we follow the same rules of the game on the two sides. Or we don't follow by the playbook that Canada would like us to follow, which are the standard international rules-based order. Unfortunately, China, as has been mentioned by several of the other witnesses who come before you, often decides to willfully ignore these rules in the way that they operate.
As the chief of Asia Pacific for CACN is the great disbalance that exists on various fronts in the activities that have been conducted by the Chinese intelligence services in Canada. To understand how they operate, we need to understand also that their methodology comes from a different set of operational standard that we don't have in the Western world. In the Western world, there's often the analogy that is used that if, for example, the Russian intelligence services wants to steal some information here, very often the analogy was used with grain of salt, of sand on the beach. And the Russian intelligence service will go in the cover of the night with a bucket and a shovel, try to fill up their bucket as much as possible and run away before the sun goes up. The Chinese intelligence services and the Chinese government use what we call mass collection process. The mass collection process, basically, they will be sending 1,000 people to sunbath all day. And when they come back at the end of the day, they shake their towels at the same spot. And the amount of information they collect is absolutely phenomenal. We talked about the disbalance because there's many institutions and then there's many people that has been employed by the Chinese intelligence services. And among them, their greatest asset is what we call the agent of influence. The agent of influence in China, in Canada, have been capable to penetrate at various levels. Although the Canadian Security Intelligence Service does not share as much information publicly as it should and does not give the briefing that as much as they should to the elected officials, we find these people all over the place, from the federal to the provincial to the municipal. Mr. Dick Fadden, who was the director of CACN many years ago, tried to warn the general public, and unfortunately he was severely reprimanded by the government at that time. At the end of the day, when we talked about the disbalance, we just need to look, for example, the number of Chinese diplomats that are in place in Ottawa versus the number of American diplomats, for example. America being our greatest business partner, and China being, we are in a trade deficit with them, and yet they have almost the double number of diplomats in Canada. Why? Because of the spy activities and the foreign interference that they do here. Thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Junot Katsoya.
Thank you very much, Mr. Junot Katsoya.
By the way, before I ask you to start, if you happen to know your colleague, Therese Arsenault, please say hello for me. Over to you for 5 minutes, please. Oh, you're muted.
Unmuted. Righto. Tēnā koutou katoa. Warm Pacific greetings from Tahuna, the traditional land of Ngāi Tahu. So I'm going to give you a very short overview of the geopolitical context to China's political interference activities, which get called United Front work. It can also be known as grey zone or political warfare. I'm encouraging you to start calling them China's active measures, because when we talked about the Soviet Union's active measures, we understood that they included intelligence operations. They included United Front work, which is a basic Soviet technique. It's not just unique to China. They included disinformation. They targeted elites. They targeted diaspora, dissident groups. So if we look at it, often when we talk about United Front, we can't really make sense of it because we don't have an equivalent. But if we understand the pattern of what is going on as China's active measures, I think it will be very helpful. And also, we're used to talking about the party-state system in China. I urge you to think about the party-state military market nexus to better understand those intertwined relationships, such as between Huawei, or between the ways in which universities are doing the work of the PLA to access sensitive technology. So onto the backdrop. I have sent the PowerPoint that I want to talk to. You are going to have a look at it later. I understand it can't be screened because of your broadcasting.
Ms. Brady, I'm
yes.
sorry to interrupt you. I'm just pausing the time for a moment. I've been asked to ask you to hold your microphone. Of course, the challenge for us is that we have interpreters to interpret those members who are francophones. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I'm in a hotel room with very limited facilities, so apologies. So the geopolitical backdrop. I've sent you some maps to look at. One of them is the new vertical map, the official map of China, a vertical world map. It's a China-centered world, and it's a literal reorienting. And the thinking behind China's very aggressive foreign policy, which Xi Jinping has sort of inherited, he didn't invent it. The thinking behind it started in the 1980s. You could even go back to 49, but the change in direction came in the 1980s. And there will be some names you might be familiar with. Alfred Mann, who talked about what a rising power needs to become influential. And one of them is developing a blue water navy and protecting sea lanes of communication, because China is obsessed about choke points. Another is Harold Mackinder, the founding figure of modern geopolitics. And a third influence is US Secretaries of State Dean Acheson and John Foster Dulles, who talked about two concepts that are very important to what's happening now. One of them is the island chain, idea of the island chain, the first, second, and third island chain, which is the basis of the series of hub and spoke defence pacts, which links the United States with allies like New Zealand, Korea, and Japan. And the second concept is peaceful evolution. This is the idea that communism would be undermined in the Eastern Bloc by greater contact with the outside world, with the Western world, through culture, education, and so on. So the CCP has been very influenced by that thinking, and under Xi Jinping, we're seeing not just a defensive response, we are seeing a very aggressive response, because China believes the West is weak and divided. So these are the four vectors of CCP active measures, as I prefer to use this term, that you can look for and you will find in Canada as elsewhere. One is efforts to control the overseas Chinese communities and their media in our society and use them as agents of Chinese foreign policy, and also sometimes espionage. 2 is elite capture, targeting our political and economic elites. And 3 is a global information strategy to try and control the international narrative about topics China's interested in. And 3rd is the Belt and Road Initiative, which is a military, political, economic bloc. So you can see how political interference fits within China's much more aggressive foreign policy as a tool of the foreign policy. It's a means to achieve China's goals without military force, to weaken opposition to China's objectives, to establish client or asset relationships with elites, even to establish collaborators within our elites, to access sensitive information and technology, in other words, espionage, to control diasporas, to control the diaspora discourse, and to control the international discourse on issues of interest to China. So if you want to, later I can talk about a resilient strategy, but that's enough for an overview. Merci beaucoup.
Merci, thank you very much. Et maintenant, nous commençons avec notre premier tour.
So we'll start with our first round with Mr. Paulus for 6 minutes. You have the floor. Thank you, Chair. And good evening for both of you. I'll start with you, Mr. Katsuya. You've talked about the links between the CACN leaders and China. And I've talked with Dr. Halpern from Andalusia University, who didn't have any concerns about these links, and Jan Swartz from the National Research Council, who said CACN is a private firm that's listed on the Hong Kong Stock Exchange. Do you think that leaders are blindly ignoring this, or have they not been guided properly by the Canadian security forces? Unfortunately, CSIS has had this policy for several years of sharing as little information as possible with Canadian companies. And that's the biggest fault, the biggest weakness that we have imposed upon ourselves. When it comes to espionage, and I agree with everything that's been said by Ms. Brady today on this, when it comes to espionage, the only way in which we can defend ourselves is with prevention. Once the wolf is in amongst the sheep, it's too late. For the moment, I think that the Canadian government, and this has not been well guided by the Committee for the Surveillance of Activities that reprimanded the CSIS when, in the past, they tried to raise more awareness amongst Canadian companies. But now the committee has been misdirected as well, I think misguided. So with Huawei, when it comes to academic financing as well, we've heard that the University of Montreal had given $3.9 million to the IT sector and other amounts of money to McGill, and concerns have been raised. What do you think about Huawei's financing of our universities? I very much agree with these concerns. During the 1990s, in my unit, we published a report, the Sidewinder report, where we studied the influence exerted by Chinese companies, and particular also by diplomatic representatives. And we found, for example, in the official reports of Canadian elections, that the Chinese embassy had given money to all of the political parties in the electoral race, and that's completely going against electoral legislation in Canada. So the game is to win influence either by buying good intentions or by recruiting people who can become agents of influence. As Stalin said, these are useful idiots, so to speak. And in that way, we can win more influence over politicians and the main intellectual leaders and trade leaders. And in that way, we can have an influence on the political and the commercial destiny of our country. Now, talking about influence, you said last year that all of these associations of Canadian citizens in Canada have all been infiltrated by the Chinese security services. And what about the RCMP and its resources that it's allocating to help people who are actually being harassed. They don't actually have these resources, and they don't understand in the RCMP exactly how this sort of influence and harassment is taking place when it comes to infiltration and the penetration of agents of the United Front work who are infiltrating these organizations is because, once again, it's very, very important for the Chinese central government to be able to control dissidents and discourse outside of China. So given that perspective, that's what's happening. When it comes to proof of infiltration, there's an excellent report drawn up by journalist Sam Cooper from the Global News, who has unveiled and shown to which extent before the pandemic started, the Chinese government had used its diplomatic representatives and the infiltration that they have in various associations to be able to get 2.5 billion items throughout the world that they brought back to China to prepare for the pandemic. And that was well before we knew that we were going to be faced with this pandemic. So that shows that they have this tentacular control that they've developed down through the years and the power that they've got to be able to reach the Chinese diaspora abroad. And I'd also like to recall that the Prime Minister had received 45 checks of $1,500 each from Vancouver. So that's another way of having influence. And now turning to Ms. Brady, you've talked about the fact that China has plans about the new nuclear submarines and icebreakers, and that we should be concerned about this. So if Chinese submarines armed with nuclear arms can be in the Arctic, would it really change the nuclear? Well, you've said it would change the nuclear balance between the US and China. So can you talk about the Chinese presence in Canadian territory, please?
Well, that's a big question to answer. But I think the pattern that we've seen is similar to what I have documented in my paper, Magic Weapons, China's Political Influence Activities under Xi Jinping, that was put up on the website of the Wilson Center. And so what I found, I used the template in that paper to look at a number of other countries, ranging from Albania to Iceland to Japan to many nations in the Pacific. And I have also been following the conversations about the influence in Canada. I would say that we find the same pattern, but each society is a little bit different, like a block of limestone. Russia and China will find the cracks.
Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Paulus.
Thank you very much to Mr. Paulus.
For 6 minutes, Mr. Frederick.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you to the witnesses. Mr. Gino Katsuya, if I could begin with you. In listening to your presentation and listening to, and reading rather, where you've been cited in the media in recent years, what you basically describe is an asymmetrical security relationship. You talk about the fact that, and if I can use the metaphor, democracies basically have a hand tied behind their back because they are confined or limited rather in what they can do because of the rule of law and because we subscribe to certain norms. Taking that into account, what can democracies like Canada do to ensure that we are protected and that our system here, our system of ensuring national security at various levels is protected against threats posed by authoritarian regimes like China's government?
Thank you very much for the question. I totally agree that we are in a disbalanced situation. We are not fighting equally. One of the reasons being is that we must return to the ballot every 5 years. There's a parity with the Chinese government. They know that they don't have to change their course of action. The next government will not necessarily have different priorities. They will simply continue. So they're planning when it comes to strategic planning, has been said in the past by their own officials. It's not plan on years, it's plan on generation. They are planting seeds today that they will be capable to harvest later on because of this capacity to go on forever. So what can we do in that perspective? Ask for reciprocity. ask for more balance between what they offer to us and what we offer to them. Give you an example. A few years ago, we sold Nexon company to a Chinese-led, government-led company for $15 billion. Try to buy a corner store in China if you can. They will, and I challenge you to be capable to even do such a thing. We won't be able to do. But when you have a energy company led by the government officials that are capable to set foot in a province like Alberta, if they need to call to the premier, they will go directly. I'm a Canadian. If I call the premier in Alberta, I'll probably be put on hold forever. So in that perspective, it's that disbalance that we are talking about that exists that we must correct and correct ourselves.
Thank you very much. Before I turn to Ms. Brady, I think it's also encouraging that under this government, at least, we've seen investment in federal policing, specifically in the area rather of national security capabilities. But your points, Mr. Katsuya, Juno Katsuya, excuse me, are very well taken. Professor Brady, thank you again for all the way from New Zealand. That's very kind of you to take part in tonight's meeting. I just wanted to ask you a very straightforward and blunt question. In terms of lessons learned from New Zealand's experience with respect to Chinese efforts at social, political, and economic influence, what are one or two that you would point to that Canada can look to and seek to implement here?
Yeah, thank you for your question. I have recently written a paper assessing over the last 4 years changes that New Zealand has made since this topic of China's political interference has come into our public conversation. So what we have seen that has been effective is the public conversation. So a series of inquiries into our parliament, having these conversations, talking about the passing new legislation, looking at the weak spots within our society. And I really highlight the legislation because in some sectors, there's a real tendency to say we can fix it, we don't want legislation because we don't offend China. And so I will highlight particularly the universities don't want to have some kind of foreign FARA legislation like the US has, but we need these kind of things. We need both legislation and we also need the conversation. So sunlight is the best disinfectant, as they say, and also public awareness. If the public know what is going on, they can also make good choices in their interactions. The problem we have had is that our Minister for National Security has barely talked about these issues at all. That's our Prime Minister. You have to take the lead from the very top, but we also saw what happened to Australia about how they started the debate first of all, and the bluntness of which it was raised perhaps was difficult. So what I would say is that, as I said, you have the public conversation in the parliament is really important. One, because you have Hansard protects people, parliamentary privilege protects people from saying things that could be difficult outside parliament. You have that it's given the seriousness, the media understands the seriousness of the issue, and legislation that will properly deal with these weak spots that China is exploiting.
Thank you very much. I have, I think, 20 seconds left, so I won't ask you another question. But at some point in your testimony, I wonder if you could comment on how to guard against any consequent rise in anti-Chinese racism or hate incidents. If a government recognizes China as a threat, and certainly I take all your points here very seriously. My worry is that we would see a consequent rise in anti-Asian hate in Canada. And any thoughts on that would be appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Precious-Caddis. We'll have to wait for that. Maintenant, on continue avec Monsieur Bergeron.
And now, Mr. Bergeron for 6 minutes. Thank you, Chair, and thank you once again to our witnesses. They are making very enlightening, relevant comments for a study. I'd just like to say to Mr. Juno Katsuya, the Canadian way, the way in which I have been expressing it for many years in the federal parliament, is that witnesses are bilingual when they're French speakers and the English witnesses just express themselves in English. So you have confirmed once again the unwritten rule with your intervention this evening. So joking apart, thank you very much for your enlightening comments. So in your book, the nest of spies. You've talked about these front companies where the only aim is to collect information for the Chinese government. That's solely why these companies exist. So what are you thinking about in Canada in terms of front companies? Well, there are several companies that have been created, in particular in the 1990s, before the handover of Hong Kong back to mainland China in 1997. Several of these companies were so-called front companies. They came here to get information, and they seemed to want to collaborate with Canadian companies. But once they'd got the necessary information they needed, they disappeared once again. And from the same angle, just to give you an example, we talked about this with the previous witness, there's the Confucius Institutes. They do exactly the same type of work now. They are basically espionage spy satellites that are sent in. For example, the director of the Confucius Institute of New Brunswick has been asked to leave Canada because of activities that looked more like espionage activities than anything else. And I had carried out examinations on a file in New Brunswick where a former director had asked to obtain from an employee of the provincial government of New Brunswick an official email for himself so they could have access to provincial government information. This gave him a foot in the door to get all of the other information from the New Brunswick government. And that's not the only incident that I can tell you about. Throughout the world, we're seeing lots of different incidents based in the Confucius Institutes or with other companies who have stolen technology and information. And in certain cases, they've also collaborated with organized Chinese crime, and that's another very troubling element when we see that the Chinese government and organized crime collude to a certain extent to be able to carry out certain activities. This is something that is currently being studied in British Columbia with the casinos, and that was revealed back in the 1990s when there was a leak to the Australian Secret Services that indicated that he was working for the Chinese service and his function had been to go to Hong Kong at the beginning of the 1990s to recruit the Triad gang so that the handover in 1997 would take place without any complications. So that's another demonstration of the collusion between organized Chinese crime and the Chinese Secret Services. Thank you very much, Mr. Juno Katsuya. Now turning to Ms. Brady, in 2019, you presented a recommendation to the New Zealand government where you said there should be a register of foreign agents set up to stop foreign interference. So what should be the criteria for this type of register being established? Is there a risk of foreign actors linked to Canada actually being on this list? What are you actually driving at with this register, and what could we develop in parallel in Canada?
Thank you for your question. I think that New Zealand and Canada and Australia have many similarities in our parliamentary systems and laws, and I think that we would benefit from exchanging information on what works and what mistakes we want to avoid. So I do think we need the system of registering of foreign agents. We need transparency, greater transparency that enable the public and companies to make good decisions about who they're partnering with in China. But we have to be also careful that we don't damage our democracy in the process. So I would recommend that there is exchanges between Australia and Canada who have already set up such a system and the United States who already have a well-established system in place. Thank you.
Mais n'est-ce pas exactement ce que fait le
Is that not what we're doing actually with Five Eyes?
Well, parliaments can talk to each other separately of the Five Eyes, signals intelligence conversation. Just because our parliaments happen to have this other relationship in Five Eyes doesn't mean that every interaction we have is Five Eyes. I'm talking to you from New Zealand. I'm nothing to do with Five Eyes. So our MPs can talk to each other. I think that would be very valuable because we love our democracy so much. We love freedom of speech and association, and privacy is important too. So how do we get the balance right? That's something I think that we can work out for ourselves.
Thank you. Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Bergeron.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bergeron.
Harris, for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to both of our guests tonight. Appreciate your presentation. First of all, Professor Brady, you did a report, presentation to the New Zealand government on interference with elections in, I think, 2017. Can you tell us a little bit about the nature of that interference? What form did it take, and is it something that we can be looking out for or should be looking out for, and what can we do about it if there is anything?
Well, each national election and also each local government election, the New Zealand Parliament does an assessment afterwards to see how it went, if there are any concerns about it. And so my government held 2 separate inquiries into foreign interference within overall review of those elections in 2017 and then local body elections in the years that followed that. And what we found is that through proxy groups, our politicians had received, CCP proxy groups or individuals had given donations to our local and central government politicians. And this is why the public conversation is very important, because you can be sure that our MPs and our mayors were not willingly receiving money from the CCP. They did not understand who their partners were. They do understand it better now. This year, in our reports to the Electoral Commission, we do not see any donations like that for the central government elections. So we saw inappropriate donations, and there are several investigations in our Serious Fraud Office at the moment into to particular cases of this. And the process of doing these cases has led to better education. We also saw in the Chinese language media in New Zealand that there was, in previous years, attempt to get the New Zealand Chinese public to block vote for certain party that had a candidate that was very much a CCP proxy. We also saw some disinformation within the Chinese language media about the elections. We also saw disguised political advertising, which breaks our electoral law. But the problem is we have very weak measures to deal with these problems. So we need to go back and look at our electoral legislation. We need to put Chinese language speakers into our Electoral Commission. We need to change our press laws too. Because one of the hardest things in New Zealand to fix, that we haven't worked out how to fix here, is how our New Zealand Chinese diaspora are being targeted by the CCP, who regards them as a resource and a tool for their foreign policy. And they are mostly the victims of these activities, and also their media, which now must follow the same censorship guidelines as the domestic Chinese language media. And our government hasn't yet worked out how to remedy this problem, although I would highlight that yesterday our foreign minister did something very good. She praised a non-CCP United Front work ethnic Chinese community group in her yesterday important speech on New Zealand-China relations. So we need to provide better support for our local Chinese communities and show that they're diverse, not all under the control of the CCP, as they would wish.
Thank you, Ms. Brady. Mr. Juno Kachoya, can I ask you a question? Back in 2007, Mr. Judd, a former director of CSIS, said about half of the time of CSIS was spent in dealing with Chinese interference. Do you have any reason to believe that is any less now, or is it more? And tell me, why is it that we hear so few or very little about people ever being charged with acts of clandestine activities, or we hear about intimidation, but we don't hear about much being done about it? Could you elaborate on those?
Yes. Just before I go, I would like to support what Ms. Brady has said. exactly what she described. We observed this right here in Canada in previous elections as well from the Chinese government. As for the prosecution and the problem of investigating, first, it has increased. We see much more interference taking place. Much more agent of influence have gained a very strategic position at all three levels of government: municipal, provincial, and federal. And when it comes to prosecution, one problem that exists is within our own system. The prosecution lies with the responsibilities of the RCMP. CSIS cannot prosecute. And unfortunately, CSIS does not play well with the other kids in the schoolyard. They don't share information that well. They don't share information like they should be sharing information. And the RCMP has lost the ability to investigate spy activities because they had been out of the game since 1984 with the creation of CSIS. So we've got to readjust this. I think the committee, the Parliamentary Committee on Security and Intelligence that was created is one way. The problem and its weakness is that every 5 years we have a new bunch of people on the committee with new bunch of analysts joining them.
Thank you. I only have 20 seconds or 15 seconds left, so I can't really ask you another question, except I am very interested in knowing whether there is an increase in the percentage of activity that's devoted towards Chinese as towards other forms of influence.
How about yes or no?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay, there you go.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Harris. We'll now go on to the second round. We have Mr. Williamson for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Brady, could I ask you just to expand on New Zealand's laws surrounding a registry of state media, foreign agents, and lobbyists, where these laws exist, where they don't, and how it's and how they're working?
You're really testing me today. So we are still having this difficult conversation within our government, and also, like problem that New Zealand has is that we only have 3 years for our parliaments. So in 2017. Suddenly, the conversation of China's political interference became something that was in the public eye as a result of my paper going public, and it confirmed what our SIS was saying, and our new government was formed. It took 6 weeks for them to form a coalition government. They had to do their own assessments. That took 6 months. And because this is difficult, completely challenged our existing thinking about China, and which had been seeing China as this economic partner, and also being kind of hopeless sense of where there was a problem, we couldn't do anything about it. So what my country decided finally was national security trumps economic security. In other words, without national security, you have no economic security. And everybody needs to know this lesson, from our businesses to our universities. And so then it took another year to start this inquiry into foreign interference, and there was a big battle to make it a public conversation. So it's a slow journey. At the end of the first inquiry, which lasts over 1 year, our Minister of Justice said we will be passing more legislation. So I think you know from your own process in Canada that this, because exactly as the problem, as Monsieur Junot Katsuya has talked about, is so bad in our societies and so endemic that it takes a long time to address. But we are addressing it, and we are slowly passing legislation, for example, on looking at overseas investment in New Zealand. Now there's a national security requirement. And so we have, I can forward a paper I've written recently that shows the legislative change. And but because we're democracies, we have to have this public conversation about it. We don't just arbitrarily change our policies. And that's our strength and also weakness and vulnerability that the CCP will play on.
That's right. Well, thank you. Well, I hope that Canada will catch up to the work that New Zealand is doing, because at this point we're having that conversation as well. So I understand exactly where you're coming from. Mr. Junot Katsuya, you said that the CSIS doesn't play well. So how can we change that? The Americans don't seem to have this challenge the same way we do. We see more activity there, more both collaboration and arrest. What do you think needs to be done to get everyone working together so the security side is working with law enforcement, so we're not just seen as a paper tiger?
We definitely need to share information. We need to receive the briefing from our experts that are following and will be allowed to share more information. There's a certain control and probably an old Anglo-Saxon reflex of not having a stiff lip and not talking too much. Let's start with our elected official. Our elected official should be briefed a little bit better on the challenges, not only coming from China, but coming from any foreign interference and any foreign influence that would come from anybody. Starting right there would be a great start. Then go to the business leaders. Involve them, work with them, share more information among agencies. One of the big flop that we had with the little cases, which is a Russian case in Halifax, I'm talking about this one, is that CSIS refused to share information with the RCMP, and the RCMP had to go and improvise all the way. This is a big challenge that we have currently.
So we've also seen this with some tragic consequences going back to the Air India bombing, of course, where information wasn't shared. So does this require a legislative change? I'm not sure just urging them to share. Do you think another oversight body is needed? A law needs to be changed to require this better behavior?
No, not necessarily a change in the legislation, but a change in the leadership and the stewardship. They need to be capable and to accept that one day they might have to testify.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Williamson. And we'll go on now to Ms. Yip. Ms. Yip with 5 minutes.
Thank you to both of you for coming on. And I know that the hour is getting later. Mr. Janu Katsuya, I have a question for you. In response, thank you. In response to the NISCOP report, national security expert Stephanie Carvin, she said, the fact that Director David Vigneault publicly named China marks a big shift in the intelligence community, calling it a huge change. What are your thoughts on this, as well as the director's recent public speeches acknowledging the threats that CCP poses to Canadians and how Canadians need to be aware of it and take measures to protect themselves?
I think it's about time we call a cat and a dog a dog. Excuse me. The probably in the modern history, China represents for Canada the most formidable opponent and threat to our democracy, to our economy as well, and to our Canadian citizens, both from Chinese descent or simply Canadian from other origin. The Chinese government perceive the relationship with others doing business not as we understand it. For the Chinese government, they are basically at war, and everything goes at war. And they're ready to do what they need to do, which is to bribe, to sort of cheat, to lie, to bully, because the name of the game is to win. That's it. That's all. At the end of the day, if you really want to understand how the Chinese government works, learn the game of Go. Because the game of Go is basically a question of acquiring territory and having influence on the board. It has nothing to do with the luck. It has to do with strategy. They are the most formidable strategists, and the use of influence is greatly important. So the change of policy, of the change of direction from the director of CSIS to finally name China what it is stand for, should be sort of also a guidance or a sign for the government and elected officials that we need also to sort of stand up to China. Unfortunately, internationally, there is dissension. Internationally, we do not work necessarily together. We just see the Huawei cases for us. When we started to weaken, some other people comes in the back and try to fill up the emptiness that we left behind us. We need to be capable to cooperate internationally and definitely try to start with working in Canada as well together. One of the great problems that I seen, for example, within the public service was we sort of had our conflict with Huawei. And shortly after the trouble started with the court procedures and everything, we saw the Global Affairs Department allowing a Chinese company, New Tech, which is equally problematic as Huawei, several $1 million to secure our embassies and our consulate. It's like the right hand is not talking to the left hand. We do certain things with the government, but we've lacked to the support of our public servant. And I'm talking the global affair. If one department should have been known in the knowledge of what was going on was these guys, I think some kick in the butt are missed here somewhere.
Thank you. I'll now turn to Ms. Brady. You mentioned in an earlier response that the New Zealand government needs to do more to support those in the Chinese community who are victims of the CCP interference. Has there been an increase in anti-Asian racism?
Thank you for your question. Actually, we haven't seen anything like the awful incidents that have been occurring in the United States, for example. We have a history of racism against our New Zealand Chinese population, a very similar one to Australia's one, where there was an idea of the yellow peril and excluding particularly women from migration to New Zealand in the gold rush days. And more broadly, we're a post-colonial society, and so we have a history of racism there as well. So far, we have not had any extreme cases. But I want to go back to the question of Mr. Fragiskatos about how we can deal with the CCP political interference activities in our countries, which for New Zealand is the top priority of our SIS. Their top job is dealing with foreign interference, which for New Zealand needs China, and yet protect our New Zealand Chinese community and signal that we see them and understand that they are the victims of the CCP's efforts to control their communities and control their media. So my government, as I said, for the last 4 years has been trying to work out, first of all, can we afford to deal with the problem? And then talking about what we're going to do. And I have been repeatedly saying to my government, first of all, when you talk about this issue, say CCP government, the People's Republic of China. Don't just say the Chinese.
Thank you, Ms. Brady.
It's dehumanizing.
Thank you, Ms.
So
Yip.
we can be careful with our language. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Ms. Yip. Maintenant, on continue avec M.
And now we'll continue with Mr. Bergeron for 2.5 minutes. Mr. Katsuya, we've listened to you speaking, and that confirms what we've been observing for some weeks now. We have the impression that the left hand doesn't really know what the right hand is doing within the government, whatever political stripe they may be. And of course, that's an advantage for countries such as China. Just to give you an example, a case that was submitted to us recently, there's financial agencies where there's a Chinese fund, and they were hired by the Canadian government to manage visas in China, and they're subcontracting with a Chinese firm. So basically, the Chinese are upstream and downstream within this arrangement. And when we asked the different intelligence authorities who had carried out the checks and controls on this company, we were greeted with a long silence because apparently no one on the Canadian government side had carried out the checks around this company. Does that set off alarm bells for you? Is that the sort of scenario that you've already experienced when you were working within the federal apparatus? Absolutely. The Chinese file is very much misunderstood by the whole of the Canadian government, and sometimes also within the CSIS itself. sometimes. We don't really perceive this threat well, and we don't understand it well. They operate differently from us, they think differently from us, and they have got very different operational means, and we don't really catch this, understand this. So we need to be stricter without turning to exclusion or racism, but we do need to be far more rigorous to be able to spot these operational techniques. It's always essential to understand this game of influence. They always play with influence, either because we're bringing in money or because they turn to certain elected officials so that they can then modify or change things or make things go in their direction. Too often, when I talked about this, even within the CSIS or within the government, people said to me, oh, it's the capitalist system. They invented the capitalist system, so they know how to play with it far better than us. They know exactly how they can lever influence. So it's this lack of awareness that's a problem. There's a lack of a listening ear. For example, in Industry Canada, there is a stage where we can consult the intelligence services about national security. If they say, no, there's a danger, then Industry Canada can refuse a foreign firm, for example, for a Chinese firm to do business here without having to unveil anything. But this is very much underused and not really listened to. Thank you very much.
I think you said me, Chair, but your voice is not coming through again, not for some reason. Thank you, though. First of all, Professor Brady, I have I guess a simplistic question. What would you say to someone who asked whether it would be effective to ask people who may not play by the rules that they should register as a foreign agent? How would such a legislation be effective in the situation that you're talking about? Could you explain how that might work?
Well, thanks for that question. So you have to be very clear-eyed about the CCP. You are not going to catch every aspect to CCP or China's active measures, CCP active measures. It's going to come at you like a wave endlessly. I think we need to learn from the experience of Lithuania, Estonia, Finland, Latvia, who have been dealing with Russian political interference for a long time. And they have what things that they do to make their society resilient, apart from having excellent laws on political interference. I recommend you look at Lithuania's laws on this, is that they educate their population. So Finland, for example, they have regular courses on disinformation for the wider public, and they don't have to say who's the source of the disinformation, they inform them. So we have to be realistic that we're not going to catch every aspect of it, but we've got the legislation and we have a good public campaign in place that will help to educate our population and keep ourselves resilient and strong. And we can expect that we're going to be getting this political interference from China under the leadership of Xi Jinping indefinitely. And that's why we have to be clear-eyed about the challenge.
So I'm asking you how it's effective, though. Would it provide, for example, if you experience some sort of interference that appeared to be on behalf of the Chinese government, that itself would give rise to a charge without having to prove anything other than the fact that this person appeared to be an agent of the Chinese government and was not registered? Is that one way it would be effective, or you're talking about education more than anything else?
What we see with the American experience is that Chinese government associated companies or actors, state media, they have to register what they are, and it helps to curb behavior. It's only one tool to deal with this. We have to have a range of tools.
Thank you, Mr. Harris. Thank you, Ms. Brody. Colleagues, noting the time and that we have another panel to come, I propose that we thank our two witnesses. So thank you so much for appearing today. It's much appreciated. We will suspend for 5 minutes for a health break and for the new witnesses to have sound checks.
Mr. Chair, just a quick point of order. I think one of the witnesses had a longer opening statement written, so if just the witnesses know that they can, if they have longer versions of their comments, they can submit those in writing, and we would appreciate seeing them.
A very helpful point of order. Thank you, Mr. Jennis, and I'm sure the witnesses heard that. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. And so I'll have suspend for 5 minutes, please. Mr. Steve Waterhouse, who's a retired captain, former Information Systems Security Officer at the Department of National Defence, and a cyber security specialist.
Christian Luprecht, professor at the Royal Military College of Canada, Department of Political Science. Thank you both for being here tonight. Monsieur Waterhouse, nous débuterons par vous par...
So we'll start with you, Mr. Waterhouse, for your opening comments. You've got 5 minutes.
Messieurs, dames, bonsoir.
Good evening. It's a real pleasure to be with you to share some points of view on the issues that I've seen, like my co-citizens, about the safety of their personal information and also the security of our trades and our means of exchange online in a modern way, given what we're facing with Chinese companies within our society. And so I'm now going to talk about the situation. Companies of all sizes, citizens and all levels of government without exception, I've realised that it's time to face up to cyber risk and cyber attacks. Over the last 20 years, there's been enormous economic downturns because of cyber operations against our companies and governments. Over the years, our researchers and developers have produced a cutting-edge technology that was envied by the rest of the world. The Chinese Secret Service, the MSS, and Chinese citizen hackers groups that are tolerated by the CCP were happy to attack our institutions and companies. So the assessments of national cyber threats 2020 from the Canadian Cyber Safety Centre and the ODNI are unanimous. China is continuing with significant, or it represents a significant cyber risk when it's wanting to have its strategic objectives of Made in China 2025 and with the centenary in 2049 to come up the CCP. So in 2021, we've observed by researchers in pharmaceutics that during this period it's been difficult to get attenuation solutions for COVID-19 because we've got external and internal threats from actors who are disturbing the development and deployment of solutions to prevent this medical crisis. Before, there were attacks against economic development, our governing institutions, our way of living, and our essential infrastructures. But just drawing on the last 20 years, China has worked hard to catch up in terms of Western innovation and development. Sorry to interrupt you, but the interpreters are finding it rather difficult to follow because you're extremely fast. So if possible, if you could try and slow down. Thank you. Yes, I'll do that, sir. So the most eloquent example for Canadians, without any doubt, is the theft of manufacturing patents, strategic plans, and all IP from Nortel between 2000 and 2009. This strategic information was passed from the hands of the MSS to the engineers while the Nortel leaders ignored warnings from the RCMP and CSIS. The actions of the 61398 Army Unit of the People's Liberation Army in Nortel continued in other parts of the world, but also in Calgary in 2012, where they infiltrated and actually stole the source code of the Telvent Industrial Controls System manufacturer, which is what we find in electric distribution networks, the system for distribution and sanitation of water, and also for the metro transit and in the majority of gas and oil pipelines throughout North America. So that means that our essential infrastructures are under even more threat and risks. And of course, there was a spectacular theft of fundamental research for the quantum security for the IT networks of the NRC in Ottawa and London 2014. And now the counter-espionage services in the US, the NCSC, are warning us against the improper, abusive collection of our DNA by Chinese pharmaceutical companies. So what can we do? Our allies of Canada have taken strategic decisions about excluding Huawei from their 5Gs, but the present government has still not decided if it's going to follow the same path as its allies or not about Huawei. On the 16th of April, the Quebec government spoke out in favour of doing business with Chinese companies such as Huawei without any threat and risk assessment. And this declaration shows that our leaders are not adequately informed about cybersecurity issues. They're more in favour of economic decisions being taken. There was a major telecom company in the Netherlands that learned to its expense that this was not a good idea because conversations were being listened into with their prime minister from China. So China has also been able to hack an electric distribution network against India. And so can we and the US actually detect this type of attack by Chinese hackers to stop this type of cyber attack on our electric grids? Because, in fact, we're in this information warfare context. So we would like you to shed light on this to see what's not working well and also to generate the necessary momentum so that the different people involved can contribute to a better physical and digital way of life so that we can once again be leaders in the global economy. And I am now available to answer your questions in both official languages. Thank you very much, Mr. Waterhouse.
Opening remarks, please proceed. You have 5 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Merci de
Thank you very much, and thank you for that invitation. I'm happy to answer your questions in both languages. I'm going to make this speech in English.
The greatest threat to Canadian Western foreign policy in decades. If you look at its military strength and how it compensates for some of its weaknesses there with its economic weight and its global ambitions, and I think the basic line here is that as Canadians, we need to start seeing the world for what it is rather than what we would like it to be. And the world as it is a highly competitive, highly contested world of geopolitical conflict, of permanent conflict below the threshold of conventional war or nuclear attack. And so what we see here is just part of this broad spectrum on where we're being pressed hard on many fronts. And this has been the case since 2008. And I think so the relationship with China is best understood as what's sometimes referred to as competitive interdependence. And so Alaska is a good example. We had an hour of grandstanding of both sides, and then we had 8 hours of strategic dialogue on key issues of common interests. And so we need to understand that there are just many issues in terms of competitive interdependence where we are fundamentally interlinked economically, for instance, but there's so many issues where and interests where we just have fundamentally irreconcilable differences. And so I think the takeaway is that Canada can't impose its will on China, but Canada also must not accept a subordinate role in that relationship. And so we have to get ready for long-term systemic competition. The competition is fundamentally about how we unlock the potential of our people and how we reach our national ambitions. And so this is ultimately, I think, more about competition than about confrontation per se. And sometimes you just need to cooperate with your competitors. So this is not a monochromatic relationship. And this is, I think, why we're here tonight, because, to the committee's credit, you're wrestling with this extremely challenging and complex relationship where we also have inescapable interdependence on everything from knowledge economies to issues such as Iran and North Korea. So what is it that Canada can do? We need to realize that what we can and can't do. So we won't decide China's regime type, and we can't determine the size of China's economy. But we can, for instance, realize that the formula that has gotten China to this point over the last 40 years, that has 4 attributes I can't go through here for the reasons of time, none of those 4 elements still apply. And so that the trajectory forward is not going to be a linear trajectory from the trajectory that we've seen sort of in the past. And so China's judgment here is that it is in no longer a stable relationship with the US, and so it needs to strengthen itself for strategic competition. And I think Canada needs to do likewise, and it needs to fortify itself with its friends. I think one of the things that we need to do is we need to counter the Chinese narrative that the East is rising, the West is in decline. Look, Chinese media are great purveyors of narratives, and authoritarian systems always excel at showcasing their strengths and concealing their weaknesses. And so we need to learn to distinguish between image and reality and not inadvertently buy in. So let's have some self-confidence. And let's not inflate the threat or weaponize it for political purposes. Let's also realize that China is not 10 feet tall, that alarmism doesn't help us here, that China has lots of vulnerabilities and Canada is much better positioned than China to meet the challenge of the 21st century. Per capita GDP, energy and food security, demographics, education, social harmony, immigration, allocation of capital, transparent legal political systems, and so forth. So instead of focusing on how we can degrade China's strengths, we need to focus on how we can bolster our own. And by doing that, it's going to be easier to unite our allies. And so the key aspect about influence is that we need to pick the choices. We need to choose the issues that are important to us and where we want to make a difference. And on those issues, we need to shrink the gap with our allies. And so we need to boost our domestic dynamism. We need to capitalize on our global network on alliances and partnerships. In the previous sessions, there's been lots of mention of the Five Eyes. The Five Eyes, of course, are no longer just a signals intelligence community. They are law enforcement, border components, human intelligence component, financial intelligence components. So there's a lot that we are doing and a lot more that can be done. And we need to shore up our global prestige because that's something that China doesn't control. It's something that we control. And so we need to ask ourselves questions. So what's of national interest to Canada? So pick the example, for instance, of Xinjiang or pick any other sort of case study. So we need to lead by example. We need to speak out clearly and consistently. We need to make it clear to China there's not going to be a normal relationship as long as that long shadow is cast over the relationship. We need to be attentive to the goods and items that are being produced with forced labor, as has already been pointed out. And we need to...
Sorry to interrupt, but your 5 minutes is up. I'm sure there'll be lots of questions for both our witnesses, and we'll have some more time for you to speak, of course. And maintenant, on commence avec notre premier tour.
So we'll now start with our first round of questions with Mr. Paulus for 6 minutes. Thank you very much, and thank you, sirs, for being with us. I've got a first question for both of you. A short answer, please. Do you agree with Christopher Barson from Citizen Lab, who said there was a constant inconsistency in the way in which Canada was drawing up its cybersecurity policies, and the federal cybersecurity policy is kind of out of date? Mr. Luprecht first. Well, the problem with the current policy is that it deals with cybersecurity as just one policy area, instead of realizing that when we're talking about policies in general in the Canada, we're talking about the cyber security side of things as well. So we have to completely overhaul the policy. So the cyber security policy at the moment is based on what we've seen over the last 20 years, and now we need to change it because the threat has evolved, but the way in which we react and the rules and regulations have not evolved, and that's why we're at a disadvantage. Thank you, Mr. Luprecht. In 2019, Huawei Canada announced a partnership with EYES Wireless Iristel to connect with the north between 2025. And Michael Byers, who's a specialist in UBC, thinks that it's serious to have a Chinese firm that holds a monopoly for the telecommunications infrastructure in the Arctic. What do you think about that? It's completely irresponsible. If we look at the history with what happened with KPN in the Netherlands, where they were able to do espionage through the biggest telecom mobile telephony networks in the Netherlands, and they were able to target judicial interventions, which meant that they were able to identify counter-espionage efforts that were being undertaken against Chinese infiltrators. Irresponsible, that's a strong word that I really appreciate there. Now, Mr. Waterhouse, there's a group of Chinese hackers called as Hafnium, and this is a group which is sponsored by the state and operates outside of China, and that it was behind the Microsoft Exchange server hack. So what's the risk for Canadian infrastructure and federal infrastructure? Well, the irony with this, Mr. Paulus, is that we needed the intervention of the FBI to be able to really dismantle certain companies that were still affected, and it took a month to realize that there had been this infiltration. They hadn't done anything during that month. So this is a threat level which is quite high. And what really strikes us here is that despite the many warnings from the official bodies, there wasn't talked about enough in the media to actually make leaders of companies aware of all of this and mandate them to react. And those who didn't react quickly saw then that it was very easy for the hackers to get into the information and to be able to get this information and lift it out of the emails. And once again, that gives them another big economic advantage. But here there will be no consequences for those who haven't done the work to actually patch things up quickly. So could you quickly give us a portrait about recent attacks from China against federal and provincial infrastructure? Do you have an idea of what's happened recently? Well, most recently, we've got the Cloud Hopper operation to attack companies that are helping other companies, MSPs, to be service providers that help companies. And CGI in Canada was infiltrated, and Canada then had access to clients, very significant clients, or Stats Canada, the NRC. Once again, with web codes, they were able to quickly intercept and patch all this, but this was a Chinese intervention because we saw this with Equifax in the US. And so what's the privileged information, the preferential information for Chinese hackers? They want to have theft of patents, and they want to get lots of information on lots of different people. As has already been mentioned by Mr. Leubrecht, they want to collect lots and lots of information, and then they filter it later. And if we look at the accumulation of personal information, there we can think of the Office of Personal Management in the US, where all of the American personal information, including security codes, was hacked. And then with Marriott Hotels and Equifax, there was a whole pool of information which would allow them to really have interesting snapshots of what was happening. And then there's facial recognition linked to all of these snapshots and these photos, so that they want to try and draw up a network and a catalogue of people. So that we have certain gaps at the federal level with cybersecurity. So I imagine at a provincial level, it's the same thing. I imagine they're not better equipped than the federal level. So I think that globally speaking, we have a problem. Yes, we have a very big problem because everyone works in silos. There's compartmentalization of information in Quebec, especially thinks they can do everything themselves, and they don't really turn to the federal government. Recently, in the last 2 years, they've been able to actually reach out and ask for assistance and information to take the right decisions about cyber risks. But that's very recent. Before, they wanted to be completely independent in Quebec. Yes, it's true. There does need to be a coordination of all of the different players when we're talking about cybersecurity. I've got 15 seconds left, so very quickly. Mr. Leubrecht, you talked about the fact that Canada is the only member of Five Eyes that's still with Huawei, and we've seen the report that's come out of the Netherlands. What should we do? Should we ban Huawei immediately or not? You've got 2 seconds left. We should have banned them years ago. Thank you very much. And thank you very much to Mr. Apollos. And now Mr. Lightbound for 6 minutes. Thank you, Chairman, and thank you for being with us this evening. That's a fascinating presentation. I'm going to turn to Mr. Leubrecht. First of all, I'm sorry if I'm not pronouncing your name properly. In your presentation, you talked about the importance of having a more solid relationship with our allies and counting on our strengths. And there was an article that you published about a month ago about the threat from Russia and China on the Arctic and Canadian sovereignty. And China wants to be almost a quasi-Arctic state by some great leap of the imagination. But I'd like to ask you about modernization of NORAD and what we can do to better protect Canadian Arctic sovereignty. Very briefly, the big difference in the last few years is that Canada has become a target because of the new arms which are at the availability of China and Russia, and now Arctic is now a geostrategically very important, a real issue. It's not just a question of renewing NORAD, but in fact we have to completely review the way in which we communicate with data within our defense systems and within the Canadian Armed Forces. And we also need to completely review our command and control system throughout our continental defense system and amongst our armed forces. Thank you very much. I'd also like to ask you about something else. Several years ago, you raised alarm bells about the fact that university researchers and university networks need to be more aware of possible interference from, for example, the People's Liberation Army, and where there's direct links with the Chinese army and these university campuses in Canada, and they infiltrate research. We've seen also with the pandemic and with COVID-19, there's the CSIS report from 2020 that mentioned that there had been a strong increase in this type of activities. We've got a parliamentary report that also mentioned the fact that we were a target of lots of different increased forces by foreign actors, in particular China, Russia, and Iran. So what is the degree of awareness of university research networks as regards this threat represented by China, amongst others? I would say that almost no one is aware of this, but increasingly, the chief information officer and universities are becoming aware of this. But we really need a complete culture shift. In the US last year, they cancelled about 1,000 visas of people who had made a misrepresentation to the authorities in terms of having links with the Canadian military, and there was another 1,000 that left suddenly. So I think we have to do the same thing in Canada. We've got the same issue, but I don't think there's been any visas that have been cancelled here. So that shows that there's a real lack of capacity here to enforce our own laws to stop this type of infiltration of our education systems. So our adversaries are jumping into this gap in the area of research. And I think there's awareness raising that needs to be launched. That CSIS has become more engaged now with the university sector over the last few years. Mr. Waterhouse, do you have some comments to make on this aspect as well? Well, I agree with what Mr. Katsuya has said. Over the last few years, and very recently, as you've said, there's been a lack of awareness, and there have not been many links between the teaching institutions and what the government was being produced, because we need to give enough information so that it becomes an interesting product, so that people can then take action when they receive this type of product and draw up the necessary policies so that we can actually prevent this theft of intellectual property, for example. I've got a final question for you, Mr. Waterhouse. We heard from Citizens Lab that we're being recommended by Citizens Lab to tread carefully with this new IP proposal. Can you talk about that initiative and what does it represent and what are the possible dangers? So with this IP, is it a new protocol or a different way of communicating? Because I believe it's a different way of communicating. We've got IP version 6, which was developed about 15 years ago, and it should take up more space with the quantity of addresses. That there's machines that are able to do this, but now we have to an adaptation in terms of security information, because with IP we've got version 4 that's being currently used, and that's the basis of internet, but it's not secure at all. So perhaps we need to give emphasis the fact that we need to adopt IP version 6 for the address plan. Thank you very much, Mr. Waterhouse. I think that's a discussion we'll need to continue because now I've got less than a minute. So thank you very much, sirs. Thank you, Mr. Lightbound.
Avec Monsieur Bergeron pendant 6 minutes.
And now Mr. Bergeron for 6 minutes. Thank you very much, Mr. Waterhouse and Mr. Lloyd-Precht, for being with us this evening. Now, Mr. Lloyd-Precht, we have been able to have a conversation just a few days ago. Mr. Waterhouse, as a Foreign Minister for Public Safety in Quebec, I was very interested to hear what you said, namely the fact that Quebec says that they can do everything alone, go it alone. And I'd like to have a coffee someday after the pandemic so that we can have a discussion about that. Anyway, I've heard you talking, and I'm really fascinated by what I'm hearing, namely what's happening with cybersecurity and the superpower China. There's Greg Austin, who's in charge of cyberspace and future conflict program at the International Institute for Strategic Studies. And he said that the cyber defense capacities of China are far lower than those of most Western powers, including Canada. For example, Canada, according to him, is at 9th out of the 150 countries that have been assessed, whereas China is at 27. So why is China still a threat for Canada, and yet Canada and other Western powers are not an equivalent or a higher threat vis-a-vis China when it comes to cybersecurity, of course, given that very interesting information in the ranking? And this is a question I'm throwing out to both of you. On you go, Steve. Well, Mr. Bergeron, I'd accept your coffee invitation whenever. I'd be happy to do that. So Mr. Austin's idea, I'm not aware of his evaluation points, so that I could say that's where China stands and this is our position. However, I can say something important to you. It's our power that's important in terms of striking. We've got many cyber soldiers in China. They have in their roster, namely on their list, they've got around 100,000 cyber soldiers, and it's 5,000 to 6,000 in the MSE in Fort Meade. In Canada, we've got around 200 or 300 people who are dedicated to cyber defense and to carry out offensive cyber attacks now. So we have to understand technology. Do we fully master this vis-a-vis China? They're able to absorb losses, whereas this would be more of a problem for us. But I think I need to study that in more detail to better understand his position. It's a question of allocation of resources. China has benefited much more from infiltrations of networks of other countries rather than having to protect its own networks from infiltration. So it's a question of how they optimize the resources that are available to them. And I'd just like to add something to you. China has a watertight network. It's very difficult to penetrate it. And it's very difficult for the population to get information out. They really control the information. That gives them another advantage. Whereas here in Canada, it's a democratic state. People can come in and out of internet as at will. Well, if understood correctly, and of course I haven't looked at Mr. Austin's data in detail, but if I've correctly understood, we have access to the technology and probably a higher quality technology, but we don't necessarily have the same amount of networks. And of course, they're able to do whatever they want. They're not held accountable with a big number of people who intervene, and we don't have that many people. Have I correctly understood? Yes, that continues from what I said to Mr. Lightfoot. It's up to you, basically. Cyber security is a political question. The quality of cybersecurity and the quality of our networks depends on you. And the trade-offs between security on the one hand and then convenience on the other hand. So it's up to you to take these decisions to make it more secure and to make Canadian citizens more secure and ensure that the tools that are used in Canada, networks and data protection, we need to really step up the security. And to make that possible, we need to have legislation that's quite binding that will also discourage people. We've talked about the bill C11 to protect personal data. If we don't have a definition about a cyber conflict, how can we talk about an actual conflict against an organization that's confronting us? Even Article 5 of NATO doesn't actually define this. So if they bring down an electric grid, is that an act of warfare or not? So we need to define that first so that we can understand the overall scope. So it does seem that there are decisions taken at another level, not just at a federal level, even at NATO level. There's decisions taken even at a global level. We don't have clear lines to be able to send out to our adversaries that if you cross this line, there will be severe repercussions. The famous crossing the red line. And if we show them these repercussions, then we need to be very clear with our adversaries and say that certain types of behaviour are quite simply unacceptable. Thank you very much.
Harris for 6 minutes. Mr. Harris, I hope you can hear me.
Thank you, Chair. And Mr. Waterhouse, I saw a profile on you describing you as one of Canada's first cyber soldiers. And I didn't know what to expect, but you look quite normal to me. But when I heard you talk about countries having 5,000 and 6,000 cyber soldiers, I realized it's obviously a term that's in use, and I didn't hear that term before. So thank you for enlightening us on that. Tell me about you told us about the threat that had taken place when the Nortel information was taken, that the codes for the systems that ran the pipelines and the electrical system were stolen. How does one overcome that? Has that been overcome? And at what cost does that damage do to industry and to the future? Can that be repaired and fixed? And do you have to restart everything to do that, or tell us?
It is very difficult to repair what has been done. Because if we take the case of Nortel, just first of all, it is the one example that the technology that was thriving at the time in the 2000, early 21st century, made Nortel one of the first and foremost technological company in the world, and made today what is Huawei, because they all transferred the technology over to Huawei. And the cherry on the sundae was finding the microphones in the Canada HQ in Ottawa when the D&D took over the infrastructure. So that's one. Two, Telvent's code, which is mesmerizing, is the fact that these codes that are present in manufactured valves installed in pipelines, they cannot be replaced overnight. They cannot be updated. So if there's a flaw found in one code that has to communicate over an infrastructure, then it is to the advantages to the attacker, where you have to mitigate that vulnerability that's present, that they won't be able to attain it. But if they have access to it, and we saw a few attacks in Turkey a few 10 years ago almost, that they were able to just create overpressure and blow up the pipeline. So that's the kind of critical infrastructure security we have to think about and review completely where we are vulnerable or not, because every time there's a cyber attack and there's a leak of information, the threat risk assessment has to be done all over again, which is absent in most cases.
Tell me about something else which concerns me. And I was reading about Citizen Lab, for example, seeing TikTok as normally following the proper rules of industry, but that is also dormant codes contained within their software infrastructure. Tell me what a dormant code is, and is there something that we need to be concerned about when we're dealing with people who we have no knowledge of their history and background?
Well, the history of TikTok is meant first and foremost as an information operation platform, meaning they can influence and they will induce some information in between the small videos. They can, if they control the platform, they can control the message. And so by doing, once the program is installed in a phone or a tablet or whatsoever technology, yes, they can activate remotely anything they want because they control it. And so it was found in a few type of similar applications that they had the reach to possibly turn on microphones, document the pictures that are in the phone, and so on. So it's a minority of these applications that are out there, but that's the reality of playing with open source, open platforms that exist, where they can go out and reach and take on the information they need.
Is that something that can occur in industrial applications as well, that you sell equipment and that included in the equipment is some kind of dormant code that allows someone else to control it 5 years later or whatever?
That what keeps me up at night, because you never know where they got the access to the code. And as we saw in a few attacks a few years ago, some NSA tools to get access to some systems were leaked out. So they have access to some types of tools, electronic tools, that is, to get access to some systems. And this is what we're talking about with Hafnium attack on Microsoft Exchange servers. So tomorrow morning, there will be another type of zero-day attack that will be coming on. And that zero-day means it's newly discovered, it's newly exploited. So that's the intricacies of technology, because there's a serious lack of quality control with the type of code that's laid out on the market. And I've underlined this at another intervention 4 years ago, saying you have medical code that is embedded into pacemakers or diabetes pumps and insulin pumps, and then remotely they can be accessed by someone who would like to do some harm to some people.
And take, for example, the electrical grid in Canada, and it's complicated and it's complex. Our pipeline grid is as well. Is there an effective defense of that to provide resilience that can be relied upon by the companies or by Canadians to know that they're safe?
Well, we're safer certainly than the U.S. because we have less companies in the U.S. than in Canada. So as often they can review the code, review the defense posture, they'll be safer every time. But this has to be done every time there's a new threat, and they don't perform these kind of threat evaluation often. So it is to do again and often to be certain they just address the right threats and apply the right mitigations.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Harris. We'll now go to the second round, and we're on to Mr. Williamson for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. Gentlemen, you both paint a rather disturbing picture in terms of challenges, and I take the point that I think often mainland China or Beijing's attempt to censor news and shut down debate is actually not a sign of strength, but it's a sign of weakness. Have you both considered the case for a slow divergence away from China? Since the open democracy, the open economy we operate in today just has too many vulnerable points. And plus, with America, the United States, advocating more nearshoring and onshoring, Japan doing the same thing, going so far as to fund its companies to repatriate home. Is there a long-term strategic case for doing that as a way to minimize the numerous security threats to our institutions, our technology, our research center, et cetera, et cetera? What say you to that argument or that line of thinking?
Well, we don't see the economic decoupling that people had intended, and we saw the harm done, for instance, by some of the Trump tariffs to the US's own economy. What we just need to do is be much more realistic about the challenges that some areas of Chinese technology intervention and the strong, persistent threat that China's ambitions present. And we need to posture ourselves accordingly instead of these homeopathic sort of approaches with our head in the sand, hoping that somehow we can turn China into a responsible actor.
And Mr. Waterhouse, what do you say?
Well, it's a different landscape than what it was, again, 30, 20 years when the economy was favorable to bring on business back to China, and they were very favorable to that. People were working over there. We had very cheap pricing, and this is how the economy was rolling big time for us here. But the game has changed, and now we have clear paths that are just set by China, just like Made in China 2025, which their main goal is to bring everything to be manufactured in China, and they'll become the world manufacturer. So if we keep that in mind, that means they don't care where they're going to get the information, and especially manufacturing, they bring it over to China, and then when it's all over, we're going to be just left standing without anything, and the only thing we'll have to do is call China to buy things at very high price. So that said, we have to acknowledge that the same economy that was driving us go to China to manufacture everything has changed. Big manufacturers of especially semiconductors are changing their game plans and now planning to make smartphones, tablets, electronics back in the US, in Vietnam as an example, or other places in Asia, because there's a real risk that at one time maybe something won't be able as flexible to go back to China to do this. And on the second front, the big chip manufacturers in Taiwan, they're considering a plan B, because if overnight China wants to take over the island as they're threatening to do, this will be a big impact on the electronic market.
No, that's absolutely right, particularly about Taiwan and their focus on the with chips. Professor Luprit, you said something. You actually think we can still influence mainland China. You're not prepared to throw in the towel that this is a communist country and they're going to use every resource they have. See, I think the hope of of WTO admission, transforming China, whether it was through the one country, two systems, and the trade regimes we've seen of the last 20 years has not borne out. But you seem to suggest you still think there's a way to change China.
Well, I think we can certainly have a number of tools available, in particular when acting with our allies, to raise the cost on certain types of Chinese behavior in order to incentivize them. I think we can also influence China through its society by being seen as good actors. There are lots of opportunities where, for instance, we can, so on things like air quality, water safety, educational opportunities, because if we're seen by the Chinese people as a good actor, it's going to be much costlier for the Chinese leadership to take actions that undermine Canada's relationship with China. And so we need a more nuanced approach.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Williamson. And now we'll go on to Ms. Yip for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you. I'm going to expand on Mr. Williamson's point and going back to your opening statement, Mr. Lichbert, where you talk about image and reality and that China has lots of vulnerabilities and that we need to bolster our own Canadian dynamicism. I do like the positive statement and really the support for Canada. What are China's vulnerabilities? What can be done to bolster our own Canadian dynamicism and innovation?
So I'll give you a quick overview of a few of them. So demographic change. So China's going to hit peak labor by 2025. It's already maxed out on its productivity gains. Currently, there's 8 working Chinese per retiree. By 2050, there'll be 2. China has a real challenge about growing old before it grows wealthy. It has rising debt levels, 300% of GDP in 2019. So China can't buy its way up the ladder the way, for instance, South Korea or Taiwan did. So China is running out of runway to catch up, which is why President Xi is doubling down, because he knows he only has so much time for China to catch up. At the same time, you have this sclerotic political system, this Leninist rigidity. You have the shrinking room for innovation. You have top-down decision-making. Bad news is never tolerated at the top. This is why we saw the challenges coming out of Wuhan and reporting on the virus. We see that rising negative views of China that are at historic highs across a diverse set of partner and allied countries, including Canada. There's budgetary constraints. There's a cooling economy. There's rising demands from its population, the aging society. There's serious risks of defaults on some of the loans from the Belt and Road Initiative that would have serious legitimacy implications for the Chinese leadership that has really sold this as the future on China. They're vulnerable on food and energy security. China can't grow enough food for its population. It imports half its oil from the Middle East. So I can go on if you'd like.
Yes, do go on about the Belt and Road Initiative.
So the Belt and Road Initiative is, of course, an opportunity to influence, in particular, the neighborhood, but also global reach. But it also comes at very high risk because, of course, China has sold this to its population as that this money will be repaid. This is a worthwhile investment. And so if if some of these investments, some of the bigger ones especially, start going sour, then the whole narrative that is around which social cohesion in China is now built, which is on the one hand the ideological narrative around nationalism, and on the other hand on economic prosperity, will ultimately be undermined. And so I think the Belt and Road Initiative presents as much opportunity for China as it presents considerable risk, especially in the aftermath of the pandemic and the economic uncertainties across many of the countries to which China has lent massive amounts of money.
Thank you. Mr. Waterhouse, I have a question about the the increase of hostile threats towards Canada's research, biopharmaceutical and life science sector during the COVID-19 pandemic. And also that NSCOPE stated that research networks in Canada, among other countries, have been targeted by intelligence collection efforts of China, Russia, and Iran. What additional security measures have organizations in these targeted sectors had to take during the pandemic?
Well, first of all, it was to acknowledge about the threat that was knocking on their door without them knowing about it. And a few instances, the CSIS went along and just informed them, counseled them on the best course of action to take to protect their network. But that was it. Compared to the U.S. response, where even we saw recently the FBI not even asking companies, they got an authorization from the Justice Department, and they went on and they entered those vulnerable servers and corrected the vulnerability that was found there. So the big difference here is they were just notified and they were left on their own to fix, and if not to protect their infrastructure without even knowing what was to be protected. So I'm pretty sure a few they got hit hard, and what's hard, it means the research they've done was just siphoned out of there back to China to their advantage and not ours.
I don't think I have any more time.
You have about 9 seconds, so that's probably that's close enough to
Thank
no time.
Okay,
thank you very much, Ms. Yip. Et maintenant, on continue avec M. Bergeron pendant 2 minutes.
And now we've got Mr. Bergeron for 2.5 minutes. So a quiz question. Do you think that China is the main threat to Canada's security currently? China has represented the biggest threat for several decades, but it doesn't represent an existential threat to Canada. Representing it as an existential threat will mean it'd be harder to have a coalition of allies and partners to impose constraints on China's behavior. CSIS, in its 2020 report, has said that China has established, as we saw in a conference on the 9th of April, if you think that geopolitics is not interesting, then geopolitics will get interested in you. So outside of Canada, there's always a threat present. And with TMAC and the mining, then Canada would have had a foot in the Arctic with its Huawei Telecoms network, and also with the East-West pipeline, and also close to NORAD responsibility and the massive electricity grid. So the answer is yes, they are a threat, and they always want more. So, Mr. Waterhouse, what do you think when Mr. Lloyd Price said that China is not an existential threat to Canada compared to, say, the USSR in the past? Well, compared to the Soviet Union, we were a real obstacle for them to reach the US. But with China, as Professor Lloyd Precht has said, China will come to Canada to do its shopping because they've got materials that they need for production. We've got lots of drinking water. We've got lots of materials to feed their populations. So we're a primary resource for this processing country. And as all eyes are fixed on China, is there not a risk that Russia would carry out certain maneuvers without us really noticing? And then suddenly we see that there would be troops amassed at the Ukrainian border. So should we continue to keep a serious eye on Russia as well, and also North Korea and Iran, and on international organized crime? That was why I was very disappointed when sanctions were announced by President Biden. We didn't see that anything in Canada because there were at least 100 companies that have been affected, and President Biden said that some types of behavior are not acceptable. I think we need to be a better ally in Canada.
30 seconds. Mr. Harris, please. You're muted.
I think we're off. Okay. Sorry, I have a question, the Chair, for either witness, really. We've heard from Mr. Juno Kachayu that CSIS spends over half its time dealing with the foreign influence of China. We know that the numbers for Chinese diplomats in Canada are huge compared even to the United States being here. Is there a reason why Canada is a particularly subject to Chinese attempts as this? Is it because of our vulnerabilities, or is it because we pose a fairly rich target for Chinese interests, whether it be intellectual property such as Nortel or scientific advancement, or access to minerals, or research, or what is it? Is there an answer to that question, or are we just part of their influence around the world?
We're a diverse society. We're a highly digitized and highly technological society, all the things that you listed. But look, here's the contrast. So last week, Christopher Wray, the director of the FBI, testified before Congress and indicated that the FBI opens a new investigation of China every 10 hours. So there's about 32.5 million businesses in the US, and there's 2,000 active investigations going on. So by comparison, Canada, we have about 1.23 million businesses. And so that would suggest that we should have statistically 75 open investigations and 1 new case every month. How many cases, Mr. Harris, do we actually have? We need a federal police force that can deliver on federal priorities. And we need to have a federal government that is committed to making sure that we have a force that doesn't spend 85% of its time and resources doing contract policing. In the 21st century, it is not acceptable that we have a federal force that cannot deliver on federal priorities.
Mr. Waterman?
I second the motion. I mean, federal resources should tackle on federal problems so that we can then evolve into a better country. Yes.
And China, why is China's interest here? Is it because we're vulnerable or because we're rich?
Because we have weak laws, they can bribe, they can, as Mr. Junot has just said, they can invest into the political system and then work their way around and make even modify laws to their advantage. And yes, we are a commodity to them.
It's markets of opportunity. Look, the US, Australia, UK are much harder targets than Canada because of the sort of legal and so ecosystem, the homeopathic security intelligence system that we have.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Mr. Harris, il nous reste que peut-être 5 minutes. Alors,
and we've just got about 5 minutes left to divide between Mr. Paulus and Mr. Dubois. So first of all, Mr. Paulus. Well, you took me by surprise. I thought I ran out of time. Mr. Lobrecht, you said that Canada was the only big democracy that didn't have its own foreign intelligence agency compared to other G7 countries. Has that had an impact at the start of the pandemic vis-a-vis China? Without a doubt. For example, if you look at countries that were very well positioned with their intelligence agencies, such as Taiwan, Australia, and even Vietnam, they were very quick to roll out a response, not just because of their intelligence services, but also because they've got a capacity.
Strategic assessment capability, where the US, Australia, UK each have a strategic assessment capability. In Canada, we don't have one. So we don't have the capacity to fournir du conseil stratégique.
We cannot give strategic advice and pass on strategic information to our government. And we also didn't have a biosecurity plan.
Roughly, if we take it, un service de renseignement nous coûterait à peu près 500.
So an intelligence service would cost about 500 million. So it's a premium.
We spent on the pandemic. I think that's a premium worth paying.
Merci. Très intéressant.
Thank you very much. That's very interesting. And now, Mr. Waterhouse. We're talking about C159, where there needs to be a review in 2022. What do you think needs to be changed in terms of cybersecurity? First of all, there needs to be recognition that this is a subject that affects all departments in all spheres. And there needs to be an active education program rather than a passive one. We've got fantastic information that's produced by the Cybersecurity Centre in Canada. It's recorded on a website, but it's not actively deployed on the ground. And even IT professionals don't even know that this exists. I've had to do interventions with clients and institutions on this subject. So if the government can actively spread that type of knowledge, then that would really help the population as a whole. Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Paulus. And now Mr. Dubourg for 2.5 minutes. Thank you very much, Chairman. Good evening to Mr. Leprecht and Mr. Waterhouse. Thank you for contributing to our study. First of all, Mr. Leprecht, I'm very happy to hear from you. I think it's one of the only times where a witness has talked about this vulnerability aspect of China and those types of elements so that we can adapt. Even if you've said that there's certain federal political priorities that need to be adjusted. And then Mr. Waterhouse, well, at the beginning of your presentation, when you were talking about metros and pipelines and so on, I was rather worried. Now, you are a former intelligence officer, and in 2021, do you find that the security infrastructure here in Canada has actually gone backwards? It hasn't gone backwards, but it's a victim of technology that's underdeveloped. Because, as I've said, there's not much quality review with the IT codes, because we imagine there will be corrections in the future if there's a problem with these codes. So that means that essential applications for a society use code that's really not been updated. That means that our society is rather vulnerable. Now, we've now got the NC COP. We've got this infrastructure that comes up with recommendations. Do you think that's a good thing? No. It's all about talking but not acting. So this committee has to go out in the field and talk to people who maintain this equipment to understand how bureaucratic complexity can be overcome to deal with these problems. So we need to do this physical work, and that really helped to regulate things. Now, Mr. Waterhouse, I know I don't have much time left, but for a year and a half, I was on that committee, and we did go from one department to another, whether it was the NRST, the communication establishment people. We met with the high-level officials, but you didn't work with the workers on the ground. Thank you very much to the speakers, and thank you to Mr. Dubourg, and thank you very much to the witnesses. We very much appreciate that you've come to be with us this evening. And this meeting is now adjourned. Have a wonderful evening.